Chapter 1. The Footsteps on the Ceiling. The affair began on a crisp October evening, when the great chandelier of the Winterbourne Hotel glittered over a gathering of society's most distinguished and most self-conscious faces. The air was rich with the scent of lilies and champagne, and the hum of conversation was punctuated by the occasional chiming of cutlery against fine porcelain. Outside, London streets lay slick with rain, their lamps blurring into golden pools, but here within the ballroom's high walls, warmth and opulence reigned. Lady Margaret Wickham, the hotel's owner and a widow of considerable fortune, had chosen this evening to host a charity auction for the restoration of the city's oldest music hall. The guests were the usual constellation of minor aristocracy, wealthy patrons of the arts, and those who had made their fortunes in ways too modern to discuss in polite company. It was a sort of event where everyone pretended to be there for the cause, but each watched one another with careful eyes, measuring influence like the weight of fine silver. It was during the spirited bidding for a diamond brooch, once worn, it was claimed, by a doomed Edwardian stage actress, that the first disturbance came. A murmur rippled through the room. People turned confused, for the sound was unmistakable yet utterly impossible. A slow, deliberate tread, footsteps, coming from above their heads, not along the corridors of the upper floors, no, but directly overhead, and the ballroom ceiling was a painted masterpiece that concealed nothing but the cavernous attic above. Each step was measured, heavy in the silence, and there was something unsettling in the way they paused, then began again, as though the unseen walker listened between strides. The orchestra faltered mid-waltz. Lady Margaret, cheeks flushing, tried to laugh it off, perhaps a servant moving store chairs, but her voice was thin, unconvincing. Those closest to her noted that her fingers, gloved in pearl gray, tightened around her glass. A few gentlemen exchanged looks and excused themselves to investigate, climbing the narrow service staircase to the attic. The crowd below waited, restless. The auctioneer attempted to resume, but the mood had shifted. Whispers now coursed through the gathering like a draft beneath a locked door. When the men returned, their expressions were troubled. They claimed to have found no one, only the dust of long abandonment, and a single set of footprints in the dust, leading halfway across the attic floor and stopping abruptly. Lady Margaret, clearly flustered, insisted the matter was closed. But the night was not done with its strangeness. At the close of the evening, when the last guests were preparing to leave, a piercing cry echoed through the lobby. It came from the direction of room 407, where Sir Reginald Mather, an aging industrialist known for both his wealth and his capacity for enemies, was staying. By the time people rushed upstairs, the scene was fixed in their minds forever. Sir Reginald lay sprawled across the carpet, his face turned away, one hand extended toward the writing desk, as though trying to reach it. His eyes were open, yet unseeing, and on the pale plaster of the ceiling above him, faintly visible in the flicker of the electric light, were dusty, unmistakable marks, footprints, leading directly over his head. A maid swore she had heard them not 10 minutes before the cry. Another swore she had passed the corridor outside, without seeing a soul. There was no sign of forced entry. The door had been locked from the inside, and the only key, apart from the one in Sir Reginald's pocket, was kept in the hotel safe. As the guests and staff milled about in anxious speculation, a small, fastidious gentleman in a perfectly tailored suit stepped quietly into the lobby, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the rain outside. He was an unexpected arrival, for no one had noticed his name on the guest list. He removed his hat with precise gesture, his dark eyes taking in every detail. It was Hercule Poirot, and though he said little at first, there was a peculiar sharpness in the way his gaze traveled from the footprints on the ceiling to the still figure on the floor, and then to the strained, pale face of Lady Margaret Wickham. He looked, in short, as though he had already begun to hear the footsteps himself, those that had brought death to the Winterbourne Hotel. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The corridor outside room 407 had settled into that brittle quiet which follows shock, the hush in which every breath seems too loud and every movement an intrusion. A thin velvet rope had been strung across the doorway to keep back the curious, though curiosity flowed past it like water around a rock. Lady Margaret stood a little apart, her fan half open and unmoving, while the hotel manager, Mr. Quayle, a narrow man with a furrow for a mouth, murmured to the uniformed constable who had been first to answer the maid's frantic cries. A few paces away hovered a cluster that would soon harden into a company of suspects. Sir Reginald's secretary, Miss Elspeth Vale, composed and pale, Lady Margaret's nephew, Julian Wickham, whose restless eyes wandered between the ceiling and the body, and Mr. Lionel Corbett, an industrial rival of Sir Reginald's, whose mustache bristled like a small animal prepared to fight. Hercule Poirot removed his gloves with fastidious care, each finger sliding free as though from a delicate sheath. "If it is permitted," he said to Mr. Quayle in his precise, courteous voice, "I will enter the room. She must tell her story while she is still fresh." Mr. Quayle began to protest about the police. Poirot inclined his head towards a constable, who, recognizing the little man's reputation with an eagerness that did Mr. Quayle no favors, lifted the rope. Poirot cast a brief, understanding look at Lady Margaret as he passed. She gave the tiniest nod, as if grateful to yield action to a person who looked born to order chaos. Room 407 was dignified without being intimate. A writing desk by the window, 2 armchairs flanking a small coal grate unlit, a wardrobe with beveled mirrors, and a bed turned down as if for some other guest night. Sir Reginald lay on the floor between desk and bed, one hand extended toward the blotter, as though he had reached for a last word and found the alphabet exhausted. His face wore an expression that was almost puzzled. Poirot's gaze rose at once to the ceiling. The marks were fainter than the murmurs in the corridor had suggested, yet unmistakable. Ovals and half-ovals, the smudged, dusty suggestion of shoe-leather treads, set in a wavering diagonal above the desk, leading toward a door and vanishing at the cornice. He stood very still beneath them, head slightly tilted, as if listening to the footsteps long after they were gone. Then, moving with small, efficient steps, he stood on the chair by the desk to bring his eyes nearer to the plaster. "Eh bien," he murmured. "It is truly the fashion now. Less promenades, acrobatiques." "What do you make of them, sir?" asked the constable from the doorway. Poirot did not answer at once. He leaned forward delicately, never letting his head touch the paint, and drew a small white card from his pocket. He held it just beneath one's smeared lips and brushed it, not touching, to observe how the dust hung in the air. He brought the card closer to his nose. Not coal soot, not lampblack, a finer powder. Dust, yes, of the attics above, perhaps, but there is something else. A trace of varnish? No, polish. One must keep the options in the mind flexible. He stepped down, restoring the chair to its exact angle, as if the furniture's dignity mattered to him personally. He knelt beside Sir Reginald, and his face became very gentle, almost fond, as it often did in the presence of the dead. "You made some effort, mon pauvre. What did you wish to tell?" He examined the fingertips. A faint gray powder smudged the right hand nails, as if they had brushed something dusty. Poirot peered beneath the nails, nodded slightly. He touched the lapel. A thread caught there, fine and pale. He pinched it free and folded it beneath the same card. At the desk, the blotter lay skewed, a corner dog-eared as if gripped hastily. The pen lay uncapped, encrusting at its tip. Poirot lifted the blotter with 2 fingers. The impression was faint, yet there, a handful of words pressed backward into the paper's grain, mirror text in patchwork. He did not ask for a mirror. He read only the shapes of the letters, the rhythm of their spacing. His eyes warmed. "You were hurried," he said softly, "and you knew the haste would be fatal to clarity." In the ashtray by the lamp, 2 cigarette ends lay together like quarrelsome cousins. One was gold-tipped, a brand Sir Reginald favored, if the rumors of his taste were true. The other was plainer, of a cheaper make, smoked to the bitter cork with the impatient chewing marks of an anxious mouth. Poirot sniffed them both. Then he sniffed the air above the ashtray and over the desk. A faint perfume. No, not perfume, he corrected himself. Spirit gum? Or theatrical adhesive. Interesting. He tested the window, locked, the catch stiff, the pane unbroken. The transom above the door, long since painted shut, bore a fine mustache of dust undisturbed. He bent to the keyhole, smooth, no scratches, and then to the door's interior bolts. Both shot. The key itself he accepted from the constable with a nod. It had been found in Sir Reginald's pocket. He turned it once, twice, feeling the mechanism. "And the other key," he asked without looking up, "is kept in the hotel safe?" Mr. Quayle, who had edged into the room, swallowed. "Yes, monsieur. It is signed out only by senior staff, and tonight," his eyes flickered, "tonight it has not been touched. The ledger is complete." "Ah, the ledger." Poirot's tone made the word sound like a gossipy friend. "We shall look at it. And the safe? In my office. We will visit le directeur's sanctum when we have paid our respects to certain small things." From the wardrobe he withdrew nothing, for it contained nothing beyond Sir Reginald's evening clothes and a dressing-gown that smelt faintly of camphor. But the mirror gave Poirot a thoughtful return of his own face, and beyond it, reflected, the ceiling marks appeared absurdly ordinary, just stains. He turned, closing the wardrobe so gently that its latch barely sighed. He crouched by the grate. The coal scuttle was full and tidy. The hearth was swept save for a few pale granules near the fender. Poirot lifted a pinch onto his card. Not coal. Plaster? Or dust from sawn timber. The attics again. He touched one granule to the tip of his tongue, grimaced theatrically, and smiled. No taste of salt. Bon. On the carpet near Sir Reginald's left side, half concealed by the bedspread, he found a single metal cap, no bigger than a child's fingernail. He looked at it a long time, then at the ceiling, then at the ashtray, and slipped the cap into his pocketbook. His eyes moved to a small scuff on the skirting board, a mark like a comma, dark and recent. He knelt, examining its height from the floor, then glanced at the legs of the chair he had earlier stood upon. Two of its casters bore fine gray rings. He pursed his lips. "Sir," said the constable, "if the door was locked and the window painted, the man could not have come in or out. And yet those—" He gestured skyward, embarrassed by the absurdity. "It's a trick, I suppose." "It is always a trick," said Poirot. "The question is only, pourquoi and to persuade whom?" He glanced at the dead man. "Tell me, when was he last seen alive?" "At 10:30, said Miss Vale from the doorway, her voice quiet but steady. "I brought him the program from Lady Margaret's auction and the receipt for his donation. He was writing a letter when I left. He seemed unsettled." "Unsettled? How?" She hesitated. "He asked me whether anyone had been in his room while he was at dinner. I said no. He said he heard odd noises, like a dragging above the ceiling." "Merci, Mademoiselle Vale." Poirot's eyes rested on her face a heartbeat longer than courtesy required, not unkindly but assessing. "And you am Whitcomb?" Julian, who had been tracing the pattern of the carpet with the toe of his patent shoe, started. "I heard the footsteps during the auction, like everyone. As for Sir Reginald, I met him in the corridor at 10. He asked me—" Julian frowned, then gave a short, nervous laugh. "He asked me whether I believed in ghosts." Mr. Corbett snorted. The man had many enemies and fewer scruples. Ghosts would be a relief. Poirot turned to him. "And yet you attend to the charity of the lady who harbors him. You are generous, Monsieur Corbett." "I support the arts," Mr. Corbett said shortly. "And I support public spectacles in which men like Mather pretend to be human." Lady Margaret's fan made a soft click as it closed. "This is grotesque," she said, with the weariness of command. "Mr. Poirot, you will have whatever assistance you require, but I beg you to conclude swiftly. The Winterbourne has never—" She broke off, and for the first time her composure trembled. "It has never been touched by a scandal." Poirot bowed. "We will do our neatest and our quickest, Lady Margaret. I ask only that the staff be made available to me, and that the attics remain undisturbed." "The attics?" Mr. Quayle repeated, blanching slightly. There is nothing there, sir. We checked." "You checked for a person," Poirot said mildly. "I will check for the things that are not people." He turned once more to the desk. In the blotter's corner, where a hand had pressed too hard, a faint smear of gray had transferred to the paper, like the shadow of a fingertip. He lifted the blotter and looked at the underside of the desk's edge. There, along the lip, ran a fine powdering of the same pale dust, interrupted by darker arcs where fingers had recently gripped. He measured their spacing with his eyes, then glanced at Sir Reginald's hands, large, blunt, stained at the nails. He looked back to the desk. You reached, he murmured to the dead man. But for what? He opened the drawer. It was empty save for hotel stationery and a small bottle of clear adhesive, common enough for mending paperbacks or sealing envelopes. The bottle's neck was slightly gummy, recently used. Poirot sniffed, smiled faintly, and set it down. On the inside of the drawer's front panel, near the lock, a tiny nick marred the varnish, as if a small metal object had glanced off it in haste. Poirot straightened, smoothing his cuffs. Quayle, we will now go to your office, SILV plate, and pay a call upon the ledger of the keys. After that, the attics. As they turned to leave, he paused at the threshold and looked up once more at the footprints on the ceiling. The little man's eyes, usually so tranquil, had acquired a brightness like the surface of a blade. He studied the pattern, the way one smudge overlapped another, the minute feathering at the edges where dust had been disturbed and then resettled. His gaze dropped to the carpet, to the faint twin grooves that ran from the chair to the desk and ended in a flourish near the skirting board. So slight, one might think them nothing more than the tracks of a careless maid's trolley. Curious, Poirot said softly to himself, almost contentedly. When the murderer wishes us to look up, it is always wise to look down. He stepped into the corridor, and the velvet rope fell back into place with a whisper, like the curtain at the end of an act not yet finished. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The manager's office of the Winterbourne was a narrow chamber of dark wood and heavier secrets. An upright desk dominated the space, its surface laid out with precision that suggested Mr. Quayle valued both order and the power of possession. Behind it, in a wall safe set eye level, rested a small collection of objects that seemed almost ceremonial. Ledgers bound in blue cloth, envelopes marked with neat black numbers, and a row of keys on polished hooks. Poirot, with the unfailing courtesy of one inspecting a friend's treasure, examined the hooks first. You keep here the master keys to each floor? Yes, monsieur, said Quayle, his voice carrying the defensiveness of a man whose efficiency had never before been in question. Each key is signed out by me personally, and the ledger records the date, time, and the staff member's name. Poirot's fingertip traced the hook for the fourth floor's master key. Empty. Quayle stiffened. That key is in the lockbox above, he said quickly, stepping to the safe's upper shelf and producing a small, shallow case. Inside lay the brass key, tagged with its number, gleaming as though it had not been touched in weeks. The ledger, if you please, Poirot murmured. Quayle slid it forward, and Poirot opened it with the reverence of a man reading scripture. The columns were orderly. Date, time out, name, time in. The last entry for fourth floor. Key was nearly a month old. The key had been returned the same day, its ink ticked crisp and precise. Poirot considered the page for a moment longer than necessary, as if the shape of the handwriting might reveal its owner's soul. Satisfied, or perhaps not, he closed the ledger and allowed the faintest smile to soften his face. Very good. And now, I think, we must speak to your guests. The gathering took place in the smaller of the hotel's two lounges, a room that seemed designed for the exchange of confidences. The curtains were drawn against the wet shine of the street outside. The lamps glowed low, catching the brass of the fireplace grate. Chairs had been arranged in a rough semicircle, though the people in them seemed unwilling to acknowledge the formality of the arrangement. Lady Margaret Wickham sat nearest the fire, her back very straight, her pearls a gleaming barricade at her throat. To her right was Julian Wickham, legs crossed carelessly, his hand toying with a cigarette he never lit. Next to him, Miss Elspeth Vale, the secretary, sat with her gloves folded neatly in her lap, her gaze steady but unreadable. Across from them, Mr. Lionel Corbett occupied his chair like a challenge, one elbow propped on the armrest, his mustache twitching whenever his eyes caught Poirot's. Beside him, Mrs. Alice Mather, Sir Reginald's estranged wife, was a study in controlled grief. Her mourning black was perfectly tailored, her eyes red but dry, as though she had rationed her tears for a more private moment. And slightly apart, as if the group had unconsciously given him space, sat Mr. Basil Torrance, an actor whose floor reputation had not yet dulled with age. He was here, ostensibly, as a guest of Lady Margaret, though whispers in the ballroom earlier suggested some older entanglement with the late Sir Reginald. Poirot entered without haste, his hands clasped behind his back, and made a small bow to the room. Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you for gathering at this unhappy hour. I will not keep you long. For the moment, I ask only that you tell me of your movements this evening. Small details, they may be important. We begin, perhaps, with Lady Margaret. Her ladyship inclined her head slightly. I was in the ballroom from the opening of the auction until the moment the commotion began. I heard the noises above us as clearly as anyone, but I thought them an embarrassment, not a danger. When the gentleman went to investigate the attic, I remained below to calm my guests. And you saw Sir Reginald during the evening? Briefly. He arrived late, just before the auction began. He congratulated me on the event, then excused himself to attend to a matter in his room. I assumed he meant a telephone call. Julian was next. He leaned forward, his tone casual but not relaxed. I had a drink with Reginald before dinner, 8:30. Perhaps. We spoke of the music hall restoration. He seemed distracted. I saw him again in the corridor at 10. As I told you, he asked me a very strange question about ghosts. Did he appear afraid? Poirot asked softly. Julian hesitated. Not afraid. More annoyed, as if something had disturbed his peace, and he disliked that more than the disturbance itself. Miss Vale's account was much as she had given before in the room, delivering the program and receipt, being asked about visitors, hearing him mention noises above the ceiling. Her voice never wavered, but her hands, folded in her lap, tightened fractionally when Poirot inquired whether she had seen anyone on the 4th floor at that time. Only Julian, just before I entered Sir Reginald's room, she said, and a chambermaid at the far end of the corridor. Mr. Corbett offered his version in a tone edged with impatience. I was in the ballroom all evening. I heard the damned footsteps. I did not go chasing after them. Why should I? This is a hotel, not a barracks. After the auction, I stepped into the smoking room for a cigar. That's when I heard the commotion upstairs. Poirot regarded him mildly. And you and Sir Reginald, you were rivals in business, yes? Corbett's mustache gave a twitch. We competed. That is not the same as this. He waved a hand in vague disdain. Mrs. Mather spoke with the weary dignity of a woman long past caring what others thought. I was in the tea-room during the auction. I had no wish to see Sir Reginald bid on trifles, while owing me a settlement he never intended to pay. I heard the noise above, yes, and I thought she stopped herself. I thought it typical of the man to be at the center of some disturbance. And yet, Poirot said gently, it is he who now lies dead and you who are still here. She did not flinch, but her eyes darkened. I had no cause to hasten that fact, Monsieur Poirot. I had waited this long. Lastly, Basil Torrance leaned back in his chair, making a steeple of his fingers. I was in the card room, winning modestly, when someone mentioned the attic footsteps. I went to the corridor out of curiosity, but saw only the gentlemen returning from their search. Sir Reginald and I were not friends, but we had been acquainted. He was a man who liked to unsettle people. Perhaps tonight he unsettled the wrong one. Poirot allowed a moment's silence to settle. He studied them each in turn, the tiny tells that even the most careful could not suppress. The tapping of Julian's unlit cigarette, the stillness of Miss Vale's posture, the flare of Corbett's nostrils, the way Mrs. Mather's hands remained folded when one might expect a handkerchief. Bon, he said at last with a small smile, you have been most obliging. There will be more questions later, naturellement. For now, I ask only one thing, that no one leave the hotel until the matter is resolved. The police will agree. Lady Margaret's chin lifted. Of course, this is a matter for discretion as much as justice. Poirot inclined his head, then turned toward the door. And now, he murmured, half to himself, we will see if the ghosts in the attic are as polite as those in the lounge. The constable opened the door for him, and as Poirot stepped out, the sound of the rain against the windows seemed suddenly louder, as though the weather itself were listening. Somewhere above, in the long-unused spaces beneath the roof, a floorboard creaked. Poirot paused, the faintest smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Curious, he whispered. The steps on the ceiling, they are still walking. Chapter 4. The attic above. The staircase to Winterbourne's upper spaces lay behind a plain service door. its paint dulled by years of the discreet comings and goings of people whose presence was never meant to be noticed. Mr. Quayle produced a key with the somber dignity of a priest unveiling a reliquary, and the constable, a lantern in hand, led the way. Poirot followed, head tilted, one hand lightly upon the banister, as though feeling the character of the house in the grain of the wood. At the third landing a draught stole past them, cool and slightly sweet, carrying an odor that was not quite the dust of ordinary neglect. Poirot paused, sniffed delicately, and his eyes narrowed with interest. "You use here for the storage. What precisely, monsieur?" he asked over his shoulder. "Old props, furniture from refits, crates for the wine," Quayle said. "Nothing of value. We never let the attics." "Non," murmured Poirot. "It is not value I anticipate." They emerged at last into a corridor of bare boards and sloping ceilings. The roof timbers ran like the ribs of a great ship. Between them, rectangles of darkness hinted at deeper voids. The lantern threw their shadows wide. Dust motes swam in its cone of light, as though stirred from a long sleep. The constable's boots made a slow, careful music. Poirot's steps, in contrast, were soft and precise, like notes placed intentionally on a page. The attic door above the ballroom stood to the right, an ungenerous panel, warped with age. The constable worked the latch, pushed, and the door swung inward with a sigh that seemed almost theatrical. Inside was a wide, low-roofed space stretching to the cornice above the ballroom. Piled chairs, folded screens, and rolled carpets lay along the walls like a muffled audience. Near the center of the dust was beautifully undisturbed. A soft gray meadow pricked here and there by the tiny footprints of spiders. And then, halfway across, the meadow ended, a crisp path of prints cut from the door toward the center, as though a single person had walked in, taken 10 measured steps, and ceased to exist. The prints were distinct, rather narrow, the heel marks clean, the tread shallow. What made them remarkable was not only the way they halted mid-space, but the perfection of the dust elsewhere. No drag, no heel sweep, no smudge where a knee had knelt or a hand had steadied. Poirot stood just within the threshold and gazed, his head a little to one side. He did not step forward. He looked not at the footprints, but at the dust beyond them, the faint flicker of the lantern revealing subtleties a careless eye would lose, a haze of disturbed powder at ankle height along the chair legs stacked nearby, a line, astonishingly straight. As a fine cord pressed to the floor and lifted, his gaze traveled up to the rafters. There, a paint flake clung to a nail, and below it, on the board beneath, a tiny comma paler, which showed where something had lately chafed the beam. "The gentleman who came earlier," Poirot asked very softly. "They walked where?" "Along that path," the constable said, pointing. "And then around the edges, looking behind those stacks. There was no one." "Ah." Poirot nodded as if satisfied that the past had behaved as expected. He removed a folded paper envelope from his pocket and, bending very slightly, took a pinch of dust from the undisturbed portion nearest the door. He held it to the lantern's glow. The granules were fine, pale gray, and threaded through with a subtler sparkle. He smiled. "Plaster. A little mica. Also perhaps the polish of the floor below. That rises through the cracks. He took another pinch from the edge of the final footprint, and from the air just above it, empty hands testing for scent and drift. "It is always the boarders," he murmured. Mr. Quayle hovered, unhappy. "Monsieur Poirot, I must insist, if there is some hazard." "The only hazard," Poirot said lightly, "is to the pride of a clever man who has worked very hard. Calm yourself, M. Quayle. We shall not trample upon his efforts. See, already your lantern has made the dust dance. We proceed with the respect due to an artist." He walked not toward the footprints, but to the left, keeping to a narrow strip near the wall, where exposed joists gave him firm footing. He passed a pair of collapsible screens stenciled with fading oriental birds, a crate of ballroom glassware cushioned in yellowing tissue, and a stack of velvet draperies that smelt faintly of the lilies downstairs. He touched nothing, but he looked at everything, and the everything began to speak. There were 2 sets of impressions in the dust along this wall, one old, softened by time, the other newer, as crisp as a path in the center. The newer trace began near a window shuttered from without and ran for 3 careful strides before vanishing, not by stopping, but by being tidied away with something soft and wide that had been drawn along the boards like an eraser. Poirot's eyes glinted. "It is an accomplice of many crimes," he said to no one. "The blanket." "Sir," said the constable, "forgive me. I talk to myself. It is the conversation I most enjoy. It is always agreeable." Near the far beam, he paused. On the vertical face of the timber was a small, polished oval, no larger than a coin, at shoulder height. He pressed his finger to it, then lifted his finger to the light. It shone. "Varnish," he said, "of a kind used for props and floors. But also," he sniffed delicately, "a cousin to the adhesive in the desk below." Mr. Quayle swallowed. "Adhesive? In Sir Reginald's drawer?" "An honest bottle," said Poirot. "Its honesty is what makes it interesting." A shape in the shadows drew his attention. He ventured closer and beheld an object half hidden behind the draperies, an old balustrade panel, its turn spindles broken, its top rail intact, and at one end a small iron bracket affixed with recent screws. On the floor near it lay a loop of cord, frayed at one point as if chewed by teeth or caught in a pulley. Poirot's hand hovered above the bracket. He did not touch. He only observed the faint crescent of brighter wood where a second bracket had once been and was now removed. "Winterbourne once had grander stairs," Mr. Quayle offered, too quickly. "We store salvage pieces here for repairs." "Just so," Poirot said. He watched the cord a moment longer, then let his gaze move back to the prints that ended mid-space. He did not measure them, not with inches. He measured them with his eyes, with the stride of a mind stepping inside a stranger's gate. Narrow feet, careful heels. He traced a line from the attic prints to the ceiling below in his imagination, saw it crossing above the point where Sir Reginald had fallen. He saw again in memory the twin faint grooves in the carpet by the desk, the dusty lip beneath the drawer, the metal cap near the bed. "Constable," Poirot said, "does a hotel have a caretaker for these upper places?" "Old Mr. Pike, sir. Night engineer. Knows the chimneys and vents." "Bond, we will speak with Pike presently. For now," he turned to Quayle, "you will oblige me by calling the chambermaid who was seen on the 4th floor. Her name?" "Nora Baines," Quayle said. "A good girl." "Naturellement," said Poirot, and his smile was as gentle as it was noncommittal. They retraced their steps, Poirot pausing once to crouch beside a narrow seam where 2 floorboards met at an angle. Here the dust along the seam had been disturbed with the head of a small brush, the bristles leaving a cone pattern barely visible even in lantern light. A splinter lay across the seam, pressed down and sprung up again. Poirot flicked it into his envelope as tenderly as if he were rescuing it from ruin. Back in the staff corridor, beneath the slope of the roof, they encountered Nora Baines, a compact girl with an open, intelligent face and a fear of the situation that made her hands busy with the apron strings. "Miss Baines," Poirot said, "forgive the hour. You were seen near room 407 tonight. Tell me of your duties there." She bobbed a curtsy she had not used since childhood. "Turned down service, sir. 8 till 10 on the 4th floor. I put the chocolates, warm the bed with a stone, air the room. Only Sir Reginald, he waved me off, said he'd no need of the stone, that his head was hot enough. He'd been," she hesitated, "listening, sir." "Listening to what?" "The sound above," she said quietly, "scraping and a kind of thump now and then, like a man shifting a heavy box. I said there's no one up there, and he said, 'No man I can see.' That's all, sir. I went along to 409. You passed anyone in the corridor?" "Only Mr. Whitcomb, sir, and Miss Vale, like she said, and 2 porters with a champagne crate, but that was earlier, before 9. Mr. Pike, I saw going toward the boiler closet at 10:30, but he's always about. And afterwards, when the cry came, I was on the back stairs, sir, fetching extra towels for 412. I heard the scream and ran toward it, but by the time I came round the long way, there were people everywhere." Poirot nodded. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have the eyes that see and the mouth that says only what it saw. A treasure for a hotel." She blushed, startled into a small smile despite herself, and fled. They found Mr. Pike in the boiler room, the masculine kingdom of valves, dials, and lingering heat. He was a wiry man with a face like a knot of oak and fingers stained by a lifetime of oil and ash. His deference to Quayle was automatic. His regard for Poirot was cautious, but respectful. "Never heard a thing like it, sir," he said when asked about the footsteps. "Not with folks in the ballroom. Sound carries queer up there, tricks the ear. I went to check the vents at 9. Just the usual rattle where the rain comes in the louvers. Nothing that would put boot to ceiling. You have keys to the attics?" Poirot asked. "Only to the roof hatch," Pike said. "Attics are never locked. No need. We keep them clear enough." His eyes slid sideways. "Some nights the actors, what Lady Margaret knows, beg. Pardon, my lady asked to see the old screens and fittings. The stage folk love a rummage. But that's in daylight." "Which actors?" Poirot's tone was idle. "Mr. Torrance, now and again," Pike admitted, "and others with him, last week. Wanted a panel to dress the ballroom for a photograph. We said no woodworm. He took a look all the same." Poirot's satisfaction did not show, save in the neatness with which he returned his notebook to his pocket. "You are good to tell me. One last thing. Pike, the polish used upon the ballroom floor, what brand?" "Gleam and Company, sir. Strong smell when fresh." "Ah," said Poirot, as if that confirmed something he'd been arguing with himself about. "You have been most helpful." When they returned to the lounge, the semicircle of suspects had subtly altered. The chairs were in the same places, and the faces were the same, yet some invisible line of sympathy had shifted. Mrs. Mather now sat a fraction closer to the fire. Julian had at last lit the cigarette and was attempting, unsuccessfully, to appear improved by it. Basil Torrance was reading a newspaper he had not read 5 minutes earlier. Poirot paused upon the threshold and allowed the room to take him in. "Miss Amos," he said, softly and almost cheerfully, "we progress. It is a small progress. It is always, at first, the small steps, not the grand leaps, but it is certain." He turned his eyes to Lady Margaret. "I beg, madam, that no item be removed from the attics. In particular, a broken balustrade panel with bracket, and a loop of cord that is not so innocent as it pretends. Also, the blankets stored there. Let them sleep undisturbed." Lady Margaret's gaze sharpened. "You believe the attic footsteps were manufactured?" Poirot's smile was small and exquisitely tidy. "Madam, I believe that everything tonight has been manufactured, with great care. But the craftsman, he has a failing that is universal. He cannot resist a flourish. It is the flourish that betrays him." His eyes went briefly, thoughtfully, to the unlit chandelier reflected in the lounge's black window. "And when a man wishes us to look at the ceiling, I ask myself, where did he hide his feet while we looked?" He did not wait for their answers. "Now we will rest for 1 hour," he told them. "In 1 hour, we begin the little conversations, the ones that reveal how people truly walk inside their heads. And before that, I read a ledger that will tell me who handles the most ordinary things with unusual care." He bowed, and as he turned away, something in his expression, satisfaction held firmly in leash, told Hastings, had he been there, that Poirot had found not the solution, but its shape. The little gray cells, like attentive dancers, had heard the first bar of the music. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The hour of respite had done little to soften the air in the Winterbourne. The rain outside had grown steadier, its patter on the windows a low accompaniment to the stillness inside. Poirot, refreshed and perfectly groomed as if no attic dust had ever dared touch his cuffs, took his seat at a small table in the lounge. Before him lay a notebook, a silver-topped pencil, and a small porcelain dish in which rested the trifles he had collected. The pale thread from Sir Reginald's lapel, the metal cap, a fragment of floorboard splinter, and the dust in its folded envelope. Lady Margaret, watching from a high-backed chair near the fire, had granted him the use of the lounge for his interviews, insisting that each suspect be summoned in turn. She had also ensured tea was available, though Poirot partook only sparingly. A mind, madam, like a fine clock, must not be drowned in overmuch liquid. The first to arrive was Julian Whitcomb. He came in with the restless confidence of a man who has always been allowed to enter a room without announcing himself, yet whose thoughts were not entirely at ease. He dropped into the chair opposite Poirot, crossing one leg over the other, and tapped the table with his cigarette case before producing one and lighting it. Poirot, hands folded neatly, observed the gesture with mild interest. "Monsieur Wickham, you were, I think, among the last to see Sir Reginald alive." Julian exhaled a ribbon of smoke. "That's what I told you. 10 o'clock, in the corridor. He asked about ghosts. An odd choice of subject for a man like him." "Odd in what way?" Julian smiled faintly. Reginald was a practical creature. He'd sooner believe in a double-entry ledger than in spirits. Yet he was unsettled. Poirot prompted, "Yes, but—" Julian hesitated. It wasn't fear, more irritation. Like something was happening around him that he couldn't control. That was not a state he enjoyed. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And do you believe in ghosts?" Julian's laugh was quick, dismissive. "No, monsieur. I've seen too many tricks played on people who want to believe." Poirot's eyes rested on him a moment longer. "Tricks, indeed. Tell me, monsieur, were you in the attics tonight?" Julian's brow furrowed. "Certainly not. Why should I be? Perhaps to admire the old fittings? Or to assist in some preparation for the charity event?" "No," Julian said flatly, flicking ash into the tray. "I've no interest in that part of the hotel." Poirot made a small note and smiled politely. "Merci, monsieur. That is all for now." Julian stubbed out his cigarette and left without another word. The next to enter was Miss Elspeth Vale. She moved with quiet precision, her gloves once more folded neatly in her lap as she sat. Her composure was unbroken, but Poirot noted the faint tightness around her mouth. "Mademoiselle," he began gently, "you served as Sir Reginald's secretary for how long?" 2 years, she replied. "Long enough to know he could be difficult. And tonight, when you brought in the program, he asked if anyone had been in his room. Why do you think he asked that?" "I don't know," she said evenly. "Perhaps he suspected theft. He was not a trusting man." "No, perhaps not," Poirot agreed. "Yet he was also a man who took great care with appearances. The desk was always orderly." "Usually," she admitted. Poirot tilted his head. "And yet tonight, the blotter was skewed, the pen uncapped, and there was adhesive in the drawer. Did Sir Reginald ever use such a thing in your presence?" Her eyes flickered, once or twice, to mend papers. "Or to affix something?" Poirot's voice was mild, but his gaze was not. Miss Vale shifted slightly in her chair. "If you're implying—" "I imply nothing," Poirot interrupted gently. "I ask only questions. One more. When you left his room, did you hear the noises above?" "Yes." "A scraping sound. I assumed the search in the attic had begun." Poirot smiled faintly. "Merci, mademoiselle. You may go." She rose, her movement still precise, but her eyes did not meet his as she left. Mr. Lionel Corbett entered next, his expression edged with impatience. "Monsieur Poirot, I've already told you." "Oui, you were in the ballroom and then the smoking room," Poirot said smoothly. "But you and Sir Reginald were rivals. Rivalry can breed many things: anger, envy, opportunity." Corbett's mustache bristled. "You think I killed him? Over a contract? Ridiculous. I could ruin him in the market without lifting a finger." "Ah, but perhaps that is less satisfying," Poirot suggested. "Tell me, monsieur, have you ever been in the Winterbourne's attics?" "No," Corbett said shortly, "and I've no patience for theatrics." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, you prefer a straightforward contest." "That's right," Corbett said, standing. "And this," he gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, "is anything but straightforward." Poirot let him go without another word. Mrs. Alice Mather was next, her morning dress as perfect as before. She seated herself with composure that bordered on defiance. "Madam," Poirot began softly, "you and Sir Reginald were estranged, yet you were here tonight." "I came at Lady Margaret's invitation," she said. "We have known each other since before my marriage." "And yet you saw your husband?" "No, I had no wish to." Poirot regarded her steadily. "And yet, in the tea room, you would have heard the noises above." Her gaze did not waver. "Yes, I thought them a foolish distraction." "Distraction," Poirot repeated as if tasting the word. "Perhaps that is what they were." Her eyes narrowed. "You think someone staged them?" Poirot's smile was slight. "I think nothing yet, madam. But I listen." The final interview of the hour was Basil Torrance. The actor ended with a faint air of amusement, as if he considered himself part of an elaborate play staged for his benefit. "Mr. Torrance," Poirot said pleasantly, "you've been in the attics before, yes?" The actor's brow arched. "On occasion, for curiosity's sake. They have marvelous old props. Did you visit them tonight?" "Of course not," Torrance said lightly, "though I must admit those footsteps were, well, they had a certain drama, didn't they?" Poirot's eyes glimmered. "Drama? Yes. But in theater, monsieur, the drama is rehearsed." Torrance laughed, unruffled. "If you're suggesting I stage this, I assure you I have written a better script." Poirot allowed himself a small, inscrutable smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the best scripts are those the audience believes they are watching for the first time." When Torrance had gone, Poirot sat alone for a moment, his fingertips resting lightly on the porcelain dish of clues. He considered the powder on the footprints, the cord and bracket in the attic, the adhesive, and the thread. Slowly, the corners of his mouth lifted. The pattern was beginning to take shape, not yet complete, but enough to tell him that the footsteps on the ceiling were not the central mystery, only the most visible flourish. And, as he had told Lady Margaret, it was the flourish that betrayed the craftsman. Chapter 6. The first false lead. Inspector Armberry of the Yard arrived with the rain, broad-shouldered, brisk, and with the practiced assurance of a man who prefers facts he can carry in a pocketbook. He listened without interrupting while the constable sketched the events, and Poirot added, in delicate pencil lines, those small observations that suggested a hand cleverer than fortune. When Armberry had done, he snapped his notebook shut and said, "Very good. We shall begin with the practicalities, means, opportunity, and the sort of mind of fancy walking about on a ceiling." His first act was to order a quiet, thorough search of the guest rooms. Mr. Quayle bristled and then remembered discretion. Keys were produced, maids dispatched to assist, and a hush spread to the corridors like felt laid over a drum. It was in Mr. Basil Torrance's suite that fortune, so-called, gave the inspector a firm handhold. In the wardrobe, beneath neatly folded evening clothes and a satin-lined cloak, lay a hat-box not for hats. Inside, a coiled length of strong, thin cord, a small tin of spirit gum, a pair of light-soled shoes whose treads were narrow and plain, and, wrapped in tissue, a metal bracket near twin to the one Poirot had noticed upon the broken balustrade upstairs. The bracket bore the ghost of recent screws. A bright crescent on its edge suggested something had been filed smooth only yesterday. Armberry stood over the collection with a satisfaction he did not trouble to disguise. "Theatrical gear," he said, "and not, I think, for the stage alone." Torrance, summoned, was equal parts wounded innocence and professional poise. "Inspector, cord and gum are the rosary and incense of my trade. If I had a shilling for every time I mended a mustache or a broken chair rail with that little tin, I should have bought the Winterbourne." Armberry lifted the shoes between forefinger and thumb. These soles, light smooth, one could walk very quietly with them. They would take a neat print. One could also rehearse a dance without marking a gentleman's parquet. Torrance returned silkily. "We actors are citizens, Inspector, not burglars. As for the bracket, I borrowed it last week to demonstrate a bit of business for a photograph in the ballroom. The caretaker will recall it. I returned it to the attic yesterday and found, to my irritation, that someone had meddled with its fellow." Armberry's eyes narrowed. "And the cord?" "Stage business again. Or, if you prefer, to repair a trunk. There is nothing illegal in a piece of string." There was a knock. Nora Baines stood in the doorway, breath quick with the importance of tidings. "Begging pardon, sir," she said to Armberry, "but we found this in the service stair by the third-floor landing. Caught under the skirting. Might have been kicked there." She held out a cigarette end. Plain paper, gnawed to an angry stump. Armberry compared it to the two in the ashtray from Sir Reginald's room, which he had sealed in a brown envelope. One of those was gold-tipped. The other, plain, with the impatient bite marks Poirot had noted, could have been kin to this newcomer. "Do you smoke this make, Mr. Torrance?" The actor's lip curled. "On stage, when a character demands it. In life, I prefer better tobacco. Ask the barman. He supplied me this evening with Balkan, not this domestic weed." "Balkan for the card room, perhaps," Armbury said, "and cheaper fare for the back stair." He slipped both stubs into his evidence packet with a little click of finality. "We are building a picture." Poirot, who had been quiet, tilted his head. "Allow me, mon ami." He considered the shoes, the bracket, the gum. He lifted the tin, removed the lid, and inhaled delicately. The spirit gum is indeed cousin to the adhesive in Sir Reginald's drawer. But cousins are not twins. This one has a resinous note. Pine. The other was cleaner, a laboratory preparation. Still, he set the tin down with a neatness that said he erased nothing. "The picture, she is charming." Armbury took it as agreement. "Charm will do for now. Mr. Torrance, you were in the card room at the time of the auction?" "With witnesses," Torrance said promptly, "and losing to my disgrace." "After the auction?" "In the corridor with the rest when the commotion began." "On the back stairs?" Torrance's brows rose. "If I were planning a murder, Inspector, do you think I would parade up and down the servant steps like a pantomime villain?" "No. I do not deny I've trod them at times in pursuit of a quiet exit. But tonight, no." Armbury turned to Quayle. "We'll have the barman and the gentleman from the card room, and the caretaker, Pike is it, to speak to this borrowed bracket." Pike arrived with his cap in his hand, and a look that said he liked problems that could be taken apart with a wrench. "Mr. Torrance asked to see the old pieces last week," he admitted. "Said he needed a visual. I watched him. He handled nothing he shouldn't. As for a bracket, one's gone missing its mate. Could have been taken years ago for all I know. These odds and ends go wandering. Yet this one has been newly filed." Poirot observed, glancing at the bright crescent, "a little vanity of smoothness, so it does not snag the silk." His eyes went to Torrance's cloak. There's a showman's fastidiousness in such care. Armbury took it as confirmation, and, with the momentum of a man who dislikes leaving stones unturned, continued to turn them until an untidy cairn of suspicion had risen in a lounge for all to admire. The barman recalled providing Torrance with foreign tobacco. A porter had noticed the actor near the service door earlier in the evening. Mr. Corbett, with the relish of a rival gossip, volunteered that Torrance had once performed a scene involving walking on air with wires and harness. "Enough," the inspector declared at last. "We'll take Mr. Torrance to the station for further questions." The lounge brightened at once with that particular relief people feel when danger acquires a name. Julian exhaled, his cigarette trembling just enough to notice. Miss Vale's shoulders loosened a fraction. Even Lady Margaret, who had made a point of honor not to display emotion before her staff, allowed the fan to move again in her hand. Only Mrs. Mather remained expressionless, as if the world had simply proved one more of her low expectations correct. Poirot looked from face to face with a mild, domestic expression, as if calculating how many teacups must be washed. "Inspector," he said, "before you create for yourself the inconvenience of travel through the rain, one little thing. In Sir Reginald's ashtray, the cheap cigarette, see how the paper's torn at the lip? A biter. In the stub Miss Baines found just now, the bites are wide and shallow. In Sir Reginald's room." He put the two ends side by side on the table. "This one has the mark of a narrow jaw. That one not." Armbury frowned. "Plenty of men chew a cigarette." "Plenty," Poirot agreed serenely. "But each mouth makes its own music. Also, smell if you please." He offered the envelope of dust he had collected from the attic, and the pale smear from the ceiling's footprint he had brushed onto his card. The mica in the attic dust is sharp, like tiny stars. The smear on the ceiling over Sir Reginald's desk is finer, duller, more plaster than sparkle. If the same shoes made prints above and left their dust below, I expect some family resemblance. Yet he lifted one manicured shoulder. They are distant cousins at best. Armbury's jaw set. "You suggest someone faked the attic prints and someone else killed the man?" "I suggest," Poirot said gently, that we are invited to applaud a very beautiful trick. When the conjurer draws the eye upward, the hand does its work below. It is possible our conjurer performed both parts. It is also possible he had assistance. But if you remove M. Torrance at once, you will make a noise that warns a clever one to move the second half of his apparatus. And I, who am lazy, do not wish him to tidy. The inspector regarded him. Poirot's calm had the infuriating quality of an umbrella refused in a downpour. Arnberry sighed through his nose. Very well. Mr. Torrance remains, for the moment, under a polite cloud, but he does not leave the hotel. Naturellement, said Poirot. We are all clouds tonight. Torrance gave a small, appreciative bow to the little man, and a more elaborate one to the room at large, as though he could not stop himself. You have my gratitude, Monsieur Poirot, and my dismay. There is nothing the actor fears more than being caught with properties of a play he did not write. When the group dispersed, Poirot remained at the small table, turning the tiny metal cap between finger and thumb. Arnberry, lingering, nodded at it. What is that trifle to you? A cap from a prop stylist, Poirot said, almost idly, used by draftsmen and actors who must make marks that rub away without scarring. It was near the bed. Imagine, Inspector, a man kneeling, measuring with a thread the distance between desk and skirting, marking softly the carpet so as to place a chair just so. He does not think he drops the cap. He has so much else to remember. Arnberry's impatience softened into unwilling curiosity. And the locked door? Poirot's smile was small and pink. Ah, that is a part of the trick not yet performed for us. You will permit me to watch the conjurer's hands a little longer. He is proud. He will repeat himself. Arnberry grunted. Pride has hanged better men. He tucked his notebook away. Very well. We hold the actor in sight and keep our hands off the addicts. What do you want next? Next, said Poirot, rising, we ask who profits by a dead man who disliked ghosts, who smelled polish through the cracks, and who reached for something he could not bring himself to write. We ask who owns a mouth narrow enough to bite a cigarette like that, and whose vanity requires that a bracket be filed smooth to save a cuff. And we listen for the footsteps, which will surely walk again, this time, perhaps, on a different ceiling. As he passed Lady Margaret, he paused and spoke, so low that only she could hear. Madam, you are very brave, but there is a thing you have not yet told me. When you are ready, we will talk of it. Her fan did not move. And if I am not ready, Monsieur Poirot? You will be, he said, with gentle certainty, because the person who made those steps above your ballroom cannot resist an encore. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. By the following morning, the Winterbourne had regained its polished surface. Polished, but thin. The guests moved with the guarded civility of people waiting for the next rumor to be confirmed, and the staff had perfected that particular brand of silence which is less the absence of speech than the presence of listening. Poirot breakfasted alone in a small alcove off the dining room, immaculate in his gray suit and pearl-tie pin, his coffee taken precisely black, and his roll buttered to within a quarter-inch of the edges. The Times lay folded at his elbow, but his eyes were not upon it. They watched, instead, the comings and goings of those he wished to study. Julian Whitcomb arrived late, hung over in expression if not in fact, exchanging perfunctory greetings before taking his seat. Miss Vale, already at a corner table, kept her gaze on her plate, though Poirot noted she set down her teacup each time Julian moved. Basil Torrance strolled in with his usual flourish, dressed for the stage of life rather than breakfast, and stopped to exchange some banter with Mrs. Mather, who, in black as ever, listened without encouragement. The meal ended without incident, but Poirot had seen enough to begin the day's work. He summoned the suspects to the lounge once more, though this time he did not take them in order nor individually. He chose, instead, to place certain pairs together, knowing proximity of the wrong two people could produce revelations an interrogation never would. First came Julian and Miss Vale. They sat opposite one another, Julian slouched and tapping a cigarette against his case, Miss Vale with her back straight and gloves in her lap. Messrs. E.T. Mademoiselles. Poirot began smoothly. I am curious about Sir Reginald's letter-writing. He was engaged in it when each of you saw him. But the letter itself, it has vanished. Who would wish to remove such thing? Julian gave a careless shrug. Could have been anything. Business notes, perhaps. Not necessarily connected to what happened. Miss Vale's eyes flickered. Sir Reginald kept all his correspondence, even drafts. Indeed, Poirot said softly. Yet not this one. Perhaps it contained a name, a warning, or a request for help. Julian smiled faintly at her. You'd know better than anyone what he might write. Elspeth, you typed most of his letters. Her color rose. Typed, yes, not dictated. He valued his privacy. And yet, Poirot murmured, he told you the noises above him. That was hardly private, she replied sharply. Everyone heard them. Ah, but not everyone was asked whether they had been in his room. Poirot said, It is curious. When a man asks such a question, he suspects one person in particular. And when that person is asked later about a missing letter, they grow defensive. Miss Vale's lips parted, then closed. She folded her gloves more tightly. Julian, satisfied to have shifted the discomfort, lit his cigarette at last. Poirot let the silence stand until it pressed faintly upon them both. Then he dismissed them with a small bow, his eyes noting the way Miss Vale's shoulder brushed Julian's as she passed him, and the quick glance he gave her in return. The next pairing was Basil Torrance and Mr. Corbett, a more mismatched set could hardly be imagined. Torrance, theatrical and amused, Corbett, solid and faintly disdainful. Gentlemen, Poirot said, last night Inspector Armberry found certain objects in Mr. Torrance's possession. Cord, gum, bracket. You, M. Corbett, have you ever seen these items before? Corbett shook his head. I've no interest in stage gear. And yet, Torrance put in with a lazy smile, you've an interest in making me look guilty. Perhaps you'd like to add a bottle of poison to my wardrobe just for color? I prefer facts, Corbett said coldly. Yours are poor. Facts, Torrance repeated, as though tasting the word. Like the fact you spent half the auction glowering at Sir Reginald from across the room? I don't glower, Corbett said flatly. I assess. Poirot raised a finger. Both are forms of observation, n'est-ce pas? And you both observed the same man shortly before he died. Did either of you see him with papers in his hand? Corbett shook his head again. Torrance leaned back. No papers. But he was uneasy. He looked up, he mimed tilting his head, as though listening to something above him. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And you, monsieur, have heard such sound before? On a stage, perhaps? Torrance's smile did not waver. I've heard every sound there is on a stage, my dear Poirot, and off it, too. When they had gone, Poirot called for Lady Margaret. She entered with her usual composure, though he thought he detected a shadow in her eyes. Madam, he said, last night I suggested you had not told me all you knew. You said nothing, but today I ask again. She regarded him steadily. I have no confession to make. But perhaps an observation, he said gently. Something you saw or heard, which you fear might harm the wrong person if revealed. Her fingers rested lightly on the back of the chair. I saw Julian in the service, corridor shortly before Sir Reginald's death. He had no reason to be there. I did not mention it because he is family, Poirot finished softly. And family, even when it is guilty, one wishes to protect. She did not answer, and he did not press. Merci, madam. You have been braver than you think. When she left, Poirot remained in the lounge, alone once more. He considered the morning's results. No confessions, no irrefutable facts, but tiny shifts, the settling of weights on a scale. Miss Vale and Julian, a connection unacknowledged but visible. Torrance and Corbett, hostility genuine enough to resist collusion. Lady Margaret, silent but watching. He rose, straightened his cuffs, and murmured to himself, the conjurer's hands, they are restless. He cannot resist moving one more piece into place. And when he does, mon cher, we shall see not the ghost on the ceiling, but the man on the floor who put him there. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. Poirot presented himself at Mr. Quayle's office just after 11, as exact the appointment as a metronome. The manager had the air of a man who had slept in his tie. His desk, ordinarily so symmetrical, showed the stress in small asymmetries. A blotter askew, a pencil turned point outward, a paperweight nudged off-center, as if the knight had been pushing it with a deliberate finger. "You wish to see the ledger, monsieur," Quayle said, unlocking the wall safe with the solemnity of ritual. The blue-bound volume came out with a soft whisper cloth against metal. Poirot accepted it delicately and turned to the week's entries, then stopped. Between last night's page and the previous day yawned a very neat absence. A leaf had been removed, not torn, not clumsily wrenched, but excised with a care that respected the stitching. The thread lay intact. The paper's fold showed a fine, surgical bevel where a blade had kissed it along the gutter. "Tens," Poirot murmured. "A ghost, it seems, has learned to edit." Quayle stared, color rising. That page recorded the last 3 days' movements for the fourth-floor master key. It was here last night. I initial every return. Who has access to the safe? Poirot asked mildly. "Myself alone," Quayle said, then hesitated. "Lady Margaret keeps a duplicate key for emergencies, and the accountant has a sealed envelope for audits, but that requires both of us to attend." Poirot nodded, turning the ledger so the light caught the delicate bevel. A penknife would chatter at paper like this. This cut, she is the line of a very slender blade, something that likes to make marks which are then invisible. He glanced at his porcelain dish of trifles on Quayle's desk, the little metal cap. "We will not weep for the page. The page has simply told us how vain the thief is of his neatness." A rap on the door, quick and unceremonious. Nora Baines, cheeks flushed with alarm, blurted, "Sir, monsieur, there's smoke on the service stair by the attic door." They ran. The smell met them before the smoke did. Not the choking reek of conflagration, but a dry, resinous singe, cloth scorched cleanly, something adhesive bubbling to a bitter sweetness. At the top landing, the door to the ballroom attic stood ajar. Beyond it, a low trunk smoldered like a sulk. The constable, already there, had doused most of it with a soda siphon. The hiss had subsided to a fretful sigh. Poirot knelt, untroubled by the soot that threatened his cuffs. Inside the trunk lay the remains of a blanket charred through at its folds, a handful of short cords blackened at the ends, and, nestled as if embarrassed to be found, a small paper parcel damp at the corners where the siphon had kissed it. He unwrapped it. For screws slid into his palm, bright where flame had licked off grease. A bracket shadow remained on the paper, a faint, oily outline like a ghost who had taken off his coat. "Someone makes tidy," Poirot said softly. He empties his pockets and sets them alight. Armberry, arriving with a gust of energy and rain, frowned into the trunk. "Evidence burned. That's bold." "Or frightened," Poirot said. "But fear that tidies is not the fear of discovery now. It is the fear of discovery already made, one the tidy man did not anticipate." He pinched a bit of the blanket between finger and thumb and sniffed. "This wool was used last night to smooth away footprints. Feel how the nap is flattened in strips. To burn it is to confess its labor." The constable pointed to the jamb. "And someone wedged the door with a match. See how it charred there first? A slow burn, to give him time to be elsewhere when the smoke found us." Poirot's eyes traveled the floor just outside the door. In the dust lay the crescent of a heel, not in the attic's neat meadow, but on the landing's boards. Abrupt, turned sharply as if a man had been surprised mid-step. It overlapped a fainter tread, of a similar size. He measured nothing with a tape. He measured with his gaze, his mind laying the two prints one upon the other, and finding them cousins, not twins. "Inspector," he said, "let's not decide too soon which pair of feet belong to which man. The floor keeps company with many shoes." They carried the trunk into the corridor and stamped out the last obstinate ember. As they did so, Poirot's head lifted. From below, not the clatter of alarm, but the thin, choked sound of distress, a voice smothered in a handkerchief. He and Armberry ran for the stairs. The typing room opened off a quiet passage near the tea room, one of those small annexes where business pretends it is restful. Miss Elspeth Vale lay half-slumped over the narrow desk, her hair loosening at the nape, a teacup overturned near her hand. The liquid had pooled on the blotter and run in 2 rivulets toward the edge. Even diluted, it gave off a medicinal smell that made the nose recoil before the mind had put a name to it. "Fetch the doctor." Armberry snapped, dropping to his knees. She's breathing, but shallow. Poirot lifted the cup, sniffed, and dabbed his fingertip in the residue. He touched the tip of his tongue and grimaced with delicacy. A sedative, he said. Laudanum, perhaps, or chloral. Not enough to kill, but enough to blind the eyes and loosen the hands. On the desk beneath Miss Vale's arm lay a neat sheaf of carbon paper, the top sheet smeared where the tea had kissed it. Beside it, 2 sheets of hotel stationery lay drying, their blotted imprint faint but legible enough in mirror text to any eye that had made a study of such hints. Armberry followed his gaze. What was she typing? Poirot held the paper to the light, reading not the words but their echoes dented into the sheet beneath. Regarding arrangements, ledger, duplicate, unfortunate incident, he let the paper fall back to the desk. A letter to whom? He said. To the police? To the solicitor? Or to a friend she trusts more than either? Lady Margaret's doctor arrived with professional swiftness and took command with quiet hands. She will wake, he said after a few minutes, with a headache and a sense of having lost something. Have we all not that, doctor? Poirot murmured. A small sleep, and we wait to find the page missing. They moved back into the corridor to let the doctor work. Armberry looked thunderous. Who brought the tea? Nora Baines, summoned, wrung her apron with anxious fingers. I did, sir, at Miss Vale's bell just after 11. She seemed in a hurry, asked for strong tea. I left it on the tray and went. I came back when I heard. She gestured helplessly toward the room. Did anyone go in after you? Armberry demanded. No, sir, not from the corridor. But, she faltered, there's the small service hatch from the tea room. Sir, it passes dishes when the maids are short-handed. The hatch, when opened, revealed a square throat the width of a serving plate, a little shelf on either side, and a sliding panel on runners. Poirot inspected the runners. A fresh smear of something clear and tacky glistened along the wood, only half absorbed. He touched it with a forefinger and rubbed thumb to finger. Adhesive, he said softly. Spilt, or used to quiet the rattle of a panel slid in haste? In the tea room beyond, the small shelf bore the print of the same teacup's foot ring, a faint circle in spilled sugar. Below it, on the tiled floor, tiny grains shone where a careless hand had overturned the bowl and then swept most of it back with too vigorous a palm. Among the sugar crystals, Poirot plucked a speck that was not white but amber resin. He tucked it absently into his envelope of dust. Julian appeared in the doorway, breathless with concern that overshot propriety. Is she Elspeth? She will recover, Poirot said. You knew she was here? Julian colored, flustered by having been caught at knowledge he could not disclaim. She sent a note about a matter, business. I came as soon as I could. From where? The billiard room, he said too quickly. With Torrance. Ask him. He was there. Armberry grunted. We shall. In the meantime, Mr. Wickham, you will do us the kindness of waiting with the others. Julian withdrew, relief and resentment poorly concealed. Poirot returned to the typing room as the doctor finished. Miss Vale's lashes fluttered. She drew a shallow breath that owned more to will than to medicine, and looked at Poirot with the dazed dignity of someone who disapproves of swooning. How very foolish, Mr. Poirot, she whispered. I have never fainted in my life. It is the fashion today, Poirot said gently. We all are made to sleep, ledgers, blankets, and now mademoiselle. Did you ring for tea? Her brow creased. I did, but the cup tasted odd. I thought the milk had turned. Then the room went sideways. Before you drank, Poirot said, what were you typing? She glanced instinctively toward the papers. Poirot's hand, light and precise, reassured without blocking. A copy of something I found. She stopped herself, a professional reflex fighting a human impulse. A letter, she said at last, each word careful. Sir Reginald wrote it during the auction. The blotter took an impression. I thought, if I could bring it out with a pencil, he might have been warning someone. And the letter's subject? Armberry pressed. Her gaze flicked from the inspector to Poirot and settled on the latter, as if choosing the lesser danger. He wrote of a ledger, she said, and of a duplicate key. He said that if anything happened to him, the person named would know where to look. She swallowed, but the name would not come clear. Poirot's eyes rested on her kindly. "Courage, mademoiselle. You have already given us more than the thief wished you to keep." He straightened, smoothing his cuffs. "Inspector, we have 2 new facts. The ledger tells us nothing by telling us it has been silenced, and someone has told Miss Vale to be quiet by pouring sleep into her cup. Both are the same hand, or the hand of the same imagination." Armberry scowled. "Then we arrest a man with gum on his fingers and a fondness for panels." Perhaps," Poirot said, turning the little amber grain in his envelope so it winked at the light like a mischievous eye. "But consider, the conjurer must lay one hand where all can see it, burning a trunk, making smoke, cutting a page, and with the other hand he reaches through a little hatch and salts a cup. Which hand is his true one, and who stands near enough to both performances to applaud at the right moments?" He glanced toward the lounge, where the suspects gathered in their various postures of patience. "We must change the stage, mon ami. At luncheon, we will move the tables. We will ask for different seats. We will see who is distressed when the familiar ceiling no longer stands over familiar chair. Pride," he added softly, "is a map a man carries on his face when the furniture is moved." The rain tapped on, discreet and insistent, as if it, too, had begun to enjoy the play. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. Luncheon at the Winterbourne was ordinarily a sedate affair, all polished silver and murmured talk. Today, it had the brittle edge of a stage where every actor knew he was being watched. At Poirot's suggestion, and to the mild dismay of the staff, the tables had been rearranged so that the usual seating was broken up. Some found themselves across from strangers. Others were obliged to share a table with those they might have preferred to avoid. Poirot himself sat at a small table near the center, his back to the fireplace, so that he might survey the room as one surveys a chessboard. Inspector Armberry, adopting a less conspicuous post at the far end, was equally attentive. Between them, they let the silence grow until people filled it with their own small remarks. Miss Vale, pale but determined after her morning's ordeal, found herself placed beside Mr. Corbett, an arrangement that drew from her the faint tightening of her mouth. Julian Wickham was opposite Lady Margaret, while Mrs. Mather and Basil Torrance were obliged to share a table, their contrasting styles, morning severity and theatrical levity, making for an awkward picture. Poirot took a mouthful of his consommé and let his gaze drift over the room. He was not watching lips but shoulders, who turned toward whom, who stiffened an approach, who leaned in when words were spoken. It was in these small adjustments that the map of hidden connections began to reveal itself. It was Julian and Miss Vale who provided the first contour. Though seated apart, their glances met twice in as many minutes, quick, sidelong, unacknowledged. When Corbett leaned toward Miss Vale with a remark, Julian's fingers tightened around his fork, and his answer to Lady Margaret's idle question was abrupt. At another table, Mrs. Mather's posture remained rigid, but her eyes followed Basil Torrance with something that was not quite disdain. Twice, Wade gestured in telling some anecdote, she made the smallest reactions, an incline of the head, the ghost of frown, as if recalling some private scene the others did not share. And Lady Margaret, always a picture of composure, allowed one small slip. When Julian, in reaching for salt, brushed his cuff against hers, she moved her arm not away but slightly toward him, as though unwilling to have the space widen between them. Poirot let the scene play out through the courses. He asked no direct questions, but his occasional, seemingly idle remarks drew telling answers. A comment about the weather brought from Torrance a recollection of a rainy afternoon spent exploring some of the Winterbourne's older corners with a companion who shall remain nameless. A mild inquiry to Mrs. Mather about the music hall's restoration drew a sharp retort. Reginald would never have restored anything except his own reputation. Dessert was served, pear tartlets, with a custard that steamed faintly in the chill of the dining room. Poirot took only a single bite before setting down his fork. The pattern had formed enough in his mind that he could now begin to test it. He rose, smiling with courteous apology. "Miss Amos, forgive me. I have a little request. Inspector Armberry and I would like to speak with you in pairs this afternoon. It is, how do you say, less tiring for the voice?" The first pair summoned to the lounge were Julian and Lady Margaret. Poirot arranged them on the sofa with the ease of a man setting pieces in place. "You are aunt and nephew," he began, and clearly affectionate. "It is good. Family. How rare it is to see harmony. And yet you both knew Sir Reginald, and you both, if I may say, had reasons not to love him." Lady Margaret's fan moved once before she set it aside. Sir Reginald was not always an agreeable guest, but his support for the music hall was valuable. Julian leaned back. "I barely knew him. We met at society dinners, here and there." Poirot's eyes moved between them. "And yet you met him in the service corridor last night, monsieur. Why choose that route?" Julian hesitated, his charm faltering for a moment. "Shortcut," he said at last. "I was fetching a book from my room." Poirot's smile was gentle. So thoughtful, to keep a book company when the ballroom waits. He turned to Lady Margaret. "And you saw him there?" Her eyes met Poirot's without flinching. "I did, and I asked no questions. That is my failing." When they had gone, Poirot called in Mrs. Mather and Basil Torrance. Their seating arrangement was less congenial. Mrs. Mather upright in a wing chair, Torrance sprawled like a cat opposite her. "You haven't met before, I think?" Poirot asked lightly. "Once or twice," Mrs. Mather said. Her tone clipped. Torrance smiled. "More than that. I performed at a charity gala in her husband's honor, before the honor became, shall we say, tarnished?" Poirot inclined his head. "And yet you share a table without quarrel. I wonder, did you speak last night before the commotion?" Mrs. Mather's eyes were cold. "I had nothing to say to him." "But you were in the tea-room," Torrance interjected. "I saw you when I passed. You were speaking to a waiter." Poirot caught the flicker of annoyance in Mrs. Mather's gaze. "The waiter brought me tea," she said. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "Tea again. It seems a popular instrument here at the Winterbourne." When this pair had gone, Poirot remained seated for a moment, his fingers steepled. The web of relationships was no longer invisible. There was an understanding, perhaps an alliance, between Julian and Miss Vale. There was an unspoken history between Mrs. Mather and Torrance, and Lady Margaret, for all her composure, had moved to protect her nephew with the instinct of blood. He glanced toward Armbury, who stood at the window. "You see, mon ami," Poirot said quietly, "the connections are like the beams in the attic. Some support the roof. Others merely hang there for show. We must decide which are load-bearing and which will fall at a touch." Armbury grunted. "And you think one of these connections is our murderer's path?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Not the path. The stage. The murder, like the footsteps, is a performance. And the players, they cannot help but play to their audience." Outside, the rain had thinned to a fine mist, the kind that blurs a view but leaves every surface shining. Inside, the stage was set for the next act. The small movement at luncheon, the chance remarks, the quiet glances, they had all been lines in a play whose ending only Poirot now suspected. But for that ending, he would need one more scene. And he already knew where it must take place. In the very attic where the first impossible footsteps had sounded, and where, he was certain, the true connections between these people would reveal themselves, not in dust and prints, but in words they could no longer keep from speaking. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. At 3:30, when the Winterbourne's public rooms were at their quietest and the rain had settled into a courteous drizzle, Poirot returned to the topmost landing with Inspector Armbury, the constable, and Mr. Pike. The service door yielded with its familiar sigh. Inside the attic the air was cooler, the dust untroubled by any foot but theirs. Shadows gathered in the angles of the beams like discreet conspirators. "Same as we left it," Pike said, lifting the lantern. "I've kept the lads off, sir." "Très bien," murmured Poirot. "We will disturb nothing, except perhaps an idea." He did not march to the path of prints. He approached them obliquely, as one might a shy animal. He stopped at the first of the crisp ovals that led to the middle of the floor, and drew from his pocket a small folding magnifier. The inspector's impatience made a soft noise in his throat. Poirot ignored it with perfect amiability. "Observe, Inspector," he said at last, not looking up, Upon the outer edge of this tread, do you see the tiny crescent of damage? A nibble, as if the leather had once grazed a stone. Armbury bent. A nick. All right. Poirot stepped along the path, choosing 3 more prints at varied intervals, one which the eye would take for a left foot, one for a right, and one near the place where the path ended in the air. In each he showed the same crescent, in the same place, like a signature unaltered by hand deadness. The nick repeats, he said softly. The left foot, the right foot, they have the same childhood scar. Armbury straightened. So one shoe made both prints? One shoe, Poirot assented. Pressed twice, once as himself, once as his mirror. See here. He moved the lens to a faintly different ridge along the ball of the foot, even the tiny scrape near the toe, identical to its twin. Our acrobat, he has but a single slipper. Pike gave a low, involuntary chuckle. Well, I'll be damned. Clever as paint. Clever, Poirot agreed, and proud. He thinks we will exclaim at the impossibility and forget the shoe is a narcissist. He turned then to rafters, where that first night a paint flake had clung to a nail. There was now a slightly broader paler patch, as if a loop had chafed twice rather than once. Beneath, on the exposed board, a smear faint as breath, clear when seen straight, invisible at a slant. Poirot touched it with a forefinger and lifted it to his nose. Polish, he said. Not the ballroom's Gleam and Company. This is a different cousin. Less aromatic, more practical. Something used to nourish without a sight. Pike nodded slowly. We use Draymond's in the attics. Thinner, runs into old boards. The ballroom has the posh stuff. Just so. Poirot's gaze dropped to the floor again, not at the famous footprints, but at the near-wall strip he had studied before. There a long, straight line marked the boards, a pressure line too regular for a boot and too light for furniture. He measured it with his eyes, then with 2 fingers. A batten laid down, he said, or the top rail of a poor broken balustrade. You remember, Inspector, the panel with the bracket? With such a rail and such a cord, a man could steady himself while he leaned, just so, without trusting his full weight to a beam. He asked for the lantern and held it close to a knot-hole at the far edge of the room. In the tiny depression lay a bright, no bigger than a pin's head, like a teardrop of amber arrested. Mid-fall, with the corner of a card, he teased it free, and it came away with a filament as delicate as spider silk. What's that? Armbury demanded. A varnish tear, said Poirot, smiling a little. The sort that forms when one brushes a surface with haste, and a last drop, unwilling to part, stretches and snaps. I have found its brother upon a beam in the other corner, and its cousins upon the runners of the tea-room hatch. He slipped the dot into his envelope with satisfaction he did not trouble to hide. Armbury folded his arms. You propose our conjuror primed his world, quieted a hatch, slicked a rail, laid his little one-shoed track, and made a show of it last night. But to what end? To frighten Mather? To dress the stage for murder? To assure us we were hearing a ghost when we were hearing a craftsman, Poirot said simply. He drew the eyes upward. Meanwhile, the true business, always smaller, always nearer, went unobserved. He let Pike and the constable step back with a lantern, while he himself stooped to one final print, the last of the path before the dust returned unbroken. There, in the center of the heel, was a faint oval not made by wear, a transfer, rather, of something applied. Poirot breathed on it gently. The moisture brought up a pale bloom like frost. Aha, he breathed. Inspector, do you carry upon you a mirror that will not be offended if it is borrowed? Armbury, puzzled but game, produced his pocket-glass. Poirot pressed it lightly to the oval, lifted it, and held the mirror to the lantern. A ghost of powder clung, not gray but whitish, with the least hint of cream. He sniffed. The odor was a memory rather than a scent, clean, domestic, faintly sweet. Chalk? No, something with oil in its history. French polisher's meal, Pike suggested, cut with whiting. Old trick for bringing up dull spots. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, Monsieur Pike. Exactly so. Our conjurer dressed his slipper, and in dressing it revealed his dressing-room. He straightened, dusting a fastidious speck from his cuff. His face, for a brief unguarded moment, wore the look of a child who has seen the penny under the conjurer's thumb. Then, as quickly, it closed over into its usual mildness. "Enough," he said lightly. "We have what we came for. Inspector, the rest must wait." "Wait for what?" Arnberry demanded. "For the mind to settle its little grains, like dust after the lantern passes." Poirot smiled, and for pride to do its necessary work. They left the attic as they had found it, almost on the landing. Poirot paused where the two overlapping heels had made their argument. He looked down and then up, the way a man marks a place in a book and the page to which it refers. Back below, he asked that the lounge be readied once more, and that coffee be served to everyone together at 4:00. Lady Margaret's brows rose at the order. Poirot's small bow conveyed both apology and promise. The company assembled with the reluctance of friends asked to admire a portrait they had already seen. Mrs. Mather sat with the unyielding dignity of a woman whose grief had long ago frozen into habit. Mr. Corbett, irritably efficient, checked his watch twice in as many minutes. Basil Torrance made a show of admiring a mantel clock whose carriage needed none. Julian Whitcomb drifted in a minute after the hour, the cigarette he was not allowed to light performing its choreography between his fingers. Miss Vale, pale but steady, took the chair nearest the door. Her gaze sought no one, but twice did not flee Julian's. Poirot accepted a cup he did not drink, and spoke of nothing at all, of the weather's courtesy, of the admirable quiet of the Winterbourne's carpets, of a music hall whose boards, he said, would sing again after their little surgery. He was either a fool or a man setting metronomes. At the second cup, he became suddenly practical. "Monsieur Quayle," he said, "a kindness. Would you have brought to us a ledger of the keys? Yes, the one with the page that went walking, and also the small metal case in which you keep spare razor blades for trimming the hotel's account books." Quayle blinked. "Razor blades, monsieur? Mais oui. Every office that loves neatness owns the little blue packet. I wish to admire it." He said nothing further while Quayle went, only watched the people in the room rearrange themselves internally around the request. Some minds, when they meet a blade, think of paper, others of throats. He saw the thought pass across two faces, and filed each away with the care he gave to spoons. Quayle returned to the ledger and a small tin, abashed to be made a character in the scene. Poirot took the tin, opened it, and selected from within a sliver of steel no longer than a fingernail. He held it to the light. "The gentleman who excised our page," he said amiably, "was an artist. He rode the stitching as a jockey rides a narrow fence. A penknife, she tears. A blade like this, she whispers." He slipped the sliver back, as if returning a violin to its case. Arnberry stirred. "Must we be charmed, Poirot? Or may we begin to accuse?" "You may accuse to your contentment," Poirot said cheerfully. "But He tapped lightly the porcelain saucer where his trifles lay, the pale thread, the stylus cap, the resin grain, the varnish. "Terre, I am not ready to speak to the public. I will say only this. There is a contradiction in our murderer which he cannot help but display. He is at once the man of neatness, snipping ledgers, filing brackets, smoothing rails, and the man of vanity, printing footsteps with one shoe, burning trunks for drama, dosing tea for effect. The neatness seeks to erase. The vanity seeks to be seen. Between them there is a seam. He brought thumb and forefinger together in a pinch. And in that seam I have placed a very small wedge." He rose. "Forgive me. I am like a cook who asks patience of hungry guests. I will keep only one thing to myself for a few hours. The small thought that turned inside out while I looked at the prints above and the grooves below." His eyes went briefly, significantly, to the ceiling of the lounge. "After dinner, Inspector, I will require the ballroom for a short rehearsal. There will be no orchestra, only a chair, a coil of cord, the broken balustrade rail, and, if Lady Margaret will permit, the house electrician to dim the lights on my word." Lady Margaret inclined her head, her composure restoring itself like a curtain settling. "If this will end it, Monsieur Poirot, you may have the whole hotel." "It will not end it," Poirot said gently. "It will begin the ending. The pride I wait upon. He will not resist an invitation to take his bow." He dismissed them with a smile that hid a sharpened silence. As they drifted out, he let his gaze rest for a second upon each face, one by one, as if counting them in, and when the door closed, Armberry spoke low. "You've noticed something. A very little thing," said Poirot. "A thing that would mean nothing to a man who has not polished his shoes with his own hands. And what does it mean? That the footsteps on the ceiling did not begin in the attic. They began in a room where a man of taste would never have risked scuffing his cuff." Poirot's eyes warmed with something like pity, and that the murderer, who thinks himself an artist, has forgotten that art always leaves its thumbprint on the frame. He would say no more, but when he passed the lobby a few minutes later, he paused by a small glass case that displayed the hotel silver. In its reflection, the ceiling looked farther away than it was, and the people beneath it nearer. Poirot adjusted his tie by a fraction, the way a man sets a compass, and the reflection gave back a little man who had found the secret he wished to keep, for now, in his pocket. Chapter 11. Tensions Rise. The afternoon stretched into an uneasy twilight. Rain had stopped, but a low mist had crept in from the river, softening the view from the Winterbourne's high windows and making the street lamps below bloom like pale lanterns. Inside, the guests lingered in the lounge or drifted along the corridors, their movements cautious, their words measured. It was a kind of stillness in which suspicion begins to ferment. Poirot, seated in a high-backed chair with a small notebook resting on his knee, appeared to be writing letters. In truth, he was watching the slow rearrangement of alliances, the shifting lines of sympathy that were drawing certain people together while quietly isolating others. Julian Whitcomb had planted himself near the hearth, speaking in a low voice to Miss Vale. Their posture was casual, but Poirot noted the slight tilt of Julian's body that shielded her from view, and the way she leaned in just enough to listen without seeming to do so. It was an intimacy born not of romance, but a shared risk. Across the room, Basil Torrance was holding forth to Mrs. Mather, his tone more subdued than his usual theatrical style. She responded sparingly, but once, when he made some point about artifice in the service of truth, her lips thinned in a manner that told Poirot she knew precisely what he was hinting at. Mr. Corbett, meanwhile, was restless. He moved from window to window, pausing only to glare toward the hearth where Julian and Miss Vale sat. Once, when Lady Margaret crossed the room to speak to her nephew, Corbett's eyes followed her with open mistrust, as though the very fact of her blood relation to Julian made her complicit in something unsaid. Inspector Armberry, standing near the door, murmured Poirot, "They're starting to turn on each other." Poirot's pencil made a slow tick against the page. "Mais oui, it is the nature of such gatherings when the center does not hold. A murderer is among them, and the innocent, they cannot be sure who it is, so they begin to suspect everyone, including themselves." As if to prove his point, Corbett suddenly crossed the room to Julian. "You've had more to say to the secretary today than to the inspector," he said, his voice sharp enough to turn a few heads. "Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts with the rest of us?" Julian's expression tightened. "If you have something to accuse me of, Corbett, say it plainly." "I'm saying," Corbett replied, "that you were seen in the service corridor near the time Sir Reginald died. That ledger page went missing, and your aunt just happens to have a key to the safe. Now Miss Vale here is nearly poisoned, and you're the first to rush to her side. Coincidence, is it?" Miss Vale's composure cracked for the first time. "That's enough." Her voice was low but steady. "I was attacked, Mr. Corbett. If you think that is some kind of plot, you're either cruel or a fool." Corbett's mustache bristled. "Or perhaps I am the only one willing to point out the obvious." Before Julian could reply, Lady Margaret intervened. "Mr. Corbett," she said coolly, "this is not a marketplace brawl. If you have accusations, take them to Inspector Armberry." Corbett gave a stiff bow and stalked back toward the windows, but the damage was done. The air in the lounge had thickened, the easy pretense of civility fraying like old cloth. Poirot let the silence settle before rising, his small figure somehow commanding the attention of the entire room. "Mess Amos," he said, "we are like passengers on a ship that has struck something beneath the waterline. You feel the list, you hear the creak of timbers, but you do not yet see the leak. You think, perhaps, it is in your neighbor's cabin. But you are wrong. It is here in the very middle. He let his gaze travel slowly from face to face. And now, before dinner, I ask you each to do something very simple. Consider who, among you, has shown too much eagerness to point the finger. Consider who wishes us to look upward, at ceilings, at attics, when the true business was conducted very close to the ground. Julian shifted in his chair. Miss Vale avoided his eye. Mrs. Mather's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the armrest. Basil Torrance broke the tension with a smooth, almost playful voice. "Monsieur Poirot, you do know how to set a stage." "Indeed, monsieur," Poirot replied, "but it is not I who wrote this play. I am merely ensuring that the final act will have the proper lighting." He looked toward Armbury. "Inspector, I believe our murderer is beginning to feel the itch to act again. Pride is a dangerous thing. It cannot bear to be half admired. And when the murderer senses that the audience is slipping away, he will do something to reclaim it." Armbury's brows drew together. "And you intend to let him?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "Let us say, I intend to give him the perfect opportunity." He turned back to the group. "Tonight, after dinner, we will all gather in the ballroom for a small demonstration. Nothing elaborate, merely a recreation of certain sounds and movements. I assure you it will be most instructive." The announcement drew a ripple through the room. Curious glances, a few murmurs, one or two frowns. Torrance looked intrigued, Corbett skeptical, Mrs. Mather faintly resigned. Julian glanced at Miss Vale, who returned the look with a barely perceptible shake of the head. Lady Margaret, her face unreadable, simply inclined her head. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot. You may have your audience." Poirot gave a small bow. "Merci, madame. That is all I require." As the company dispersed, Poirot remained where he was, watching them file out. Some went in pairs, some alone, but all carried within the tautness of people who know that the next scene will bring either vindication or exposure. When the last had gone, Armbury approached. "You think he'll take the bait?" Poirot allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "He will not be able to resist mon ami. A conjurer cannot bear to see his trick performed by another, and tonight I shall perform it for him, under lights he cannot control." He closed his notebook, the pencil tucked neatly inside, and rose. "By the time the clock strikes 9, Inspector, the footsteps on the ceiling will belong to no ghost. They will belong, very precisely, to a man or woman who thought that a trick was the same as a crime." And with that he walked toward the dining room, leaving Armbury with the uneasy sense that the real performance had already begun. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. By 8 o'clock, the Winterbourne's ballroom had been transformed from a theater of whispers into a stage with visible properties. At Poirot's request, a single chair stood beneath the painted dome, its legs precisely chalked on the parquet. Near lay a coil of thin cord, the broken balustrade rail with its one remaining bracket, and a small tool tray lent by Mr. Pike. Screwdriver, pliers, a spirit leveled grimly, determined to be useful. The chandelier hung unlit. Only the wall sconces burned, dimming the edges of the room, and giving to the center a hush-like breath held. Inspector Armbury stood with arms folded, his mouth a disapproving line that did not quite hide curiosity. Lady Margaret took a position by the door with the poise of a hostess, obliged to endure an avant-garde recital. The others ranged themselves uncertainly along the walls. Corbett rigid, Mrs. Mather black and still, Torrance amused, Miss Vale pale but attentive. Julian came last, his composure that of a man practicing it. Poirot made a little bow to the company. "Mess Amos, you endured last night a performance of the impossible. This evening, I propose a rehearsal of the possible. You will forgive that I do not enact the whole comedy. I have too much respect for your parquet. We will content ourselves with the suggestion of certain effects." He stepped to the chair and, without flourish, set the balustrade rail across its back so the bracket faced upward, making the chair a low, improvised stanchion. A man, alone above the ballroom, desires to leave upon the dusty evidence of 2 feet walking. He has, alas, but one slipper prepared for the task, light and narrow, its heel dressed to receive a powder that will print. He must press it twice at each step, once for each foot. Poirot's hand hovered, not touching, over the rail. He cannot, however, lean from a beam like a trapezist. He is proud, perhaps, but not foolhardy. So he steadies himself, not upon the floor, where he would mar his meadow of dust, but upon a rail here, say, braced by a cord let up over a chafed nail. He did not demonstrate further. He merely showed the line with his hands. The rail, the cord, the invisible loop aloft. To those who had seen the attic, the picture was uncomfortably clear. To those who had not, it felt clear all the same, which was more disconcerting. Observe, he continued softly. How? With a single shoe employed as a mirror of itself, the left and right acquire the same little scar upon the edge. Observe also how a prudent craftsman dresses his heel with a polishing meal, whiting, perhaps, cut with resin, to take a fine print, and then, when he breathes upon the faint remainder upon a mirror or a glass, a pale bloom appears. He broke off delicately, as if the idea were too technical to burden the group. Then he looked about with a quick, apologetic smile. Forgive, these are small matters. I say only that a vanity was here. The trick was elegant. He wished us to admire. Torrance applauded once, softly. My dear Poirot, had you chosen the stage, we might have been colleagues. I confess, the picture is admirable, but he gestured toward the ceiling with a languid hand. Who among us had both access and inclination? Access, Poirot murmured. The Winterbourne provides generously to those who know her service doors. Inclination, that is a different ledger. We will turn those pages in a moment. He let the properties be and turned gently toward people. The shift in his attention changed the room. The chair and cord seemed suddenly to withdraw like compliant extras, leaving a principal to his speech. Mr. Corbett, Poirot said, you are a man who prefers a straight line. There is no straight line in last night's entertainment. Yet your dislike of Sir Reginald was not concealed. My dislike was public, not criminal, Corbett snapped. I do not need pantomime to ruin a rival. Just so. Poirot inclined his head, as if striking a note from a tuning fork, and finding it true. Madam Mather, your hatred was older than last night, and weariness has rubbed its edge. You would sooner watch time do its work than help it. Her eyes did not change. Time is cheaper. Mademoiselle Vale, Poirot continued more gently, you attempted to wake a dead man's words. For that someone poured you sleep in a cup, those who fear a letter are rarely the ones who have just written one. Miss Vale folded her hands to keep them from answering for her. I thought he meant to name someone. I still do. We shall return to that. Poirot turned to Torrance. Monsieur, your little trunk of properties, your bracket, your gum, they are the garments of suspicion, and they fit you well enough to please the inspector. Yet your vanity would not have let you file one bracket and throw the maid into a fire like a panicked apprentice. You would have kept the pair for neatness. No? Torrance bowed a fraction. You flatter my tidiness. I correctly estimate it. Poirot smiled. Which leaves us, his eyes passed, quick as a bird's wing, to Julian, with those who live between the public rooms and the private corridors. People who know where a hatch slides, where the ledger sleeps, where a blanket may be found, where a door may be wedged to a match to burn slowly, while one is seen elsewhere saying clever things. Julian's chin lifted a degree. If you mean me, say so. I mean to ask a question. Poirot's voice became mild, almost indifferent. When one dresses a heel with a whitening meal, monsieur, and breathes upon the faint trace to make the bloom appear, does one prefer the whiting applied with a pad, or does one take the convenience of a little felt dauber? I ask because the pattern left by a pad is smoother. The dauber leaves tiny islands at the edge. It was a question designed to be innocent, and it looked so, until Julian answered too quickly, with the eagerness of a schoolboy relieved to know something. A pad, of course. A dauber would leave speckling, especially if the mixture were too thin. He stopped as if someone had touched the back of his neck with a cool coin. Heat rose along his cheekbones. That is, one might suppose so. Inspector Armberry's head came round like a gun turret. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was small and precise, like a needle entering cloth. Poirot allowed nothing to change in his face. He rescued the company with a clap of his hands. So discreet, it was almost a courtesy. Très bien. Enough theory. We will not tax the patience. Only a few small questions more, and I release you to dinner." He turned away from Julian as if the slip had been a trifle and addressed Mr. Quayle, who had hovered near the door, professional anxiety making him a shade in his own hotel. "Monsieur le Directeur, last night a page walked out of your ledger. It was cut with a razor, one of those tidy blue blades you keep. Who attend that safe each evening before it is locked?" "I do," Quayle said stiffly. "And Lady Margaret on occasion." Poirot nodded. "And yesterday?" Quayle hesitated. "Yesterday. Lady Margaret and I checked the takings together after the auction began." Lady Margaret's tone came cool as bone. "Is there an accusation hidden in that, Monsieur Poirot?" "There's a path," he said. "I lay it with care. On that page would have been written the hand that borrowed the master key during the last 3 days. The page is gone, but the borrower remains." He let the sentence balance, and then set it down. "Who else can sign out that key?" Quayle rallied to his rules. "Senior staff only. Myself, Lady Margaret, the accountant jointly, Mr. Pike for emergencies, and—" he stopped, "and—" Poirot supplied softly, "a family member who has taken to involving himself in the running of the house, nominally, these last months, for love of modern improvements and short cuts." Julian made a small, incredulous sound. "You think I signed your book to stage parlor tricks? You're mad." Armbury said, almost amiably, "Did you sign it?" Julian's mouth opened. Nothing satisfactory came out. The stillness did the rest. Poirot saved him. "Again, we shall not press. The ledger will speak in its way. When I asked Mr. Pike to show me the oiling record for the safe's hinge." "Ah, yes, you keep it, Mr. Pike. I saw your neat pencil. 12 minutes past 10, you noted a squeak and cured it. A hinge sings when opened. Last night it did not sing. Someone with oil on the fingers opened the safe recently. He carried away not money but paper, and very likely a spare blade to keep his edges pretty." A tremor ran through the company like a draft. With the smallest flick of his eyes, Poirot returned to Julian, but spoke to Miss Vale. "Mademoiselle, you told me Sir Reginald wrote a duplicate and a ledger. Did he write a name?" She looked at him steadily. He began one. It looked like an M, or perhaps a W seen in the mirror. The pencil would not come clear. Poirot inclined his head, satisfied to the point of gentleness. "Mirrors have been our trouble from the first." He closed his hands as if closing a cabinet. "Enough for now. After dinner, we will finish our little rehearsal. With lights. Before then, I will borrow our electrician and, Mr. Pike, if you please, the small pulley you keep for drawing up draperies when the ladder does not reach." He dismissed the assembly with the courtesy of a maitre d'. Chairs scratched softly. The room breathed again. People began to move, turning their bodies into the familiar lanes of escape. Toward the door, toward the bar, toward one another. Julian lingered just a heartbeat too long, then turned on his heel. As he passed the tool tray, his glance dropped, arrested by the sliver of blue-papered steel within as surely as a fish by light. It was nothing, half a second, but Poirot, who had been waiting for the hunger of a neat hand, saw the look and filed it among certainties. Only when the door had closed upon the last of them did Armbury exhale. "You played him." Poirot's eyebrows rose, modestly scandalized. "I asked a question of household management, and he told you how whiting blooms when you breathe on it." Armbury's tone was grimly satisfied. "That will do before a magistrate." "Not yet," Poirot said. "A slip is a thread, not a rope. But it will draw. Vanity tugged it, and pride will not let it go. After dinner, when the lights change, he will do something very small, very revealing. We must be ready to see the thumbprint on the frame." Armbury nodded. "And if he bolts?" "He will try," Poirot said softly. "But a man who prints footsteps on the ceiling cannot resist leaving one last mark on the floor." He looked up at the dark chandelier, his face tender with the pleasure of a pattern aligning. "Come, mon ami, we will dine. It is good for the little gray cells to be fed before they dance." Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Dinner at the Winterbourne was served with all the refinement the hotel could muster, but the meal carried a flavor of restraint. The soup was sipped rather than enjoyed. Conversation rose and fell in staccato bursts, and every so often eyes would stray toward Poirot, as if waiting for him to spring another question into the candlelit calm. Poirot, for his part, dined as though entirely preoccupied with his turbot, though Armbury, seated 2 places away, could tell by the faint twitch of the mustaches that the little Belgian was listening to every cadence of speech around the table. Lady Margaret spoke sparingly, Mrs. Mather not all unless addressed. Julian's laugh, when it came, was a shade too quick, and Miss Vale's forked paused often in midair, her mind clearly elsewhere. Torrance filled the silences with stories from his theatrical career, but even his anecdotes carried an undercurrent, as though each was a reminder that he could perform any role he chose. Dessert was barely cleared when Poirot rose, thanked Lady Margaret for her hospitality, and in his most genial tone invited the company to the ballroom for his petite demonstration. No one declined. The transition from the warm dining room to the ballroom was marked not only by the change in temperature, but by the sense of expectancy tightening the air. The single chair and the balustrade rail still stood where they had been in the earlier gathering. The electrician, a quiet man in overalls, was stationed discreetly near the wall switches. Poirot explained little. You will forgive me, MES Amos, if I control the lighting. Sometimes it is not the thing itself, but the shadow it throws that reveals the truth. He asked Armbury to place the suspects loosely around the room, no one close enough to another to whisper, without being seen. The arrangement forced Julian to stand nearer to Mr. Pike than to Miss Vale, and put Torrance in the far corner opposite Corbett. Mrs. Mather stood rigid beneath a wall sconce. Lady Margaret held herself like a sentinel near the double doors. Poirot gave a small nod to the electrician. The lights dimmed in a slow fade, leaving the chandelier above in darkness, the sconces casting long, delicate fingers of shadow across the parquet. And then it happened. From the corner of his eye, Armbury caught the swift, guilty movement. Julian, glancing upward toward the shadow dome, shifted toward the side door that led to the service corridor. It was the kind of movement one might make when intending to retrieve something or to avoid being caught with it. Poirot's voice, calm but carrying, cut through the dimness. Monsieur Whitcomb. A moment, s'il vous plaît. Julian froze, half-turned. Yes. It is a little cold in here, Poirot said pleasantly. Would you be so good as to fetch the blanket from the chair in the corner? You know the one. For the briefest instant Julian's composure slipped. He hesitated before moving toward the chair. But instead of lifting the blanket, his hand darted beneath it. Seeking, Poirot knew, the narrow packet he had placed there earlier that afternoon. A folded piece of hotel stationery with single, damning smear of whiting along one edge. Julian's fingers closed around it. But before he could pocket the paper, Armbury was beside him, hand firm on his arm. Looking for something? The inspector asked mildly. Julian's jaw tightened. You've planted this, he said, flinging the paper onto the chair. Some sort of trap. Poirot approached, his manner almost sympathetic. Mais oui, monsieur, a trap? Not for your body, but for your vanity. You could not resist recovering what you believed to be evidence you had overlooked. That is the trouble with a conjurer. He cannot bear to think that the props of his trick are in another man's hands. The electrician brought the lights back up. The paper, lying on the chair, gleamed faintly where the smear caught the light. Poirot picked it up delicately. You see, MES Amos, this little document was bait. It tells us nothing, merely an empty page dressed with the same meal that was on the heel which made the sealing prints. But it is enough to draw the hand that dressed it. Julian's color rose. This proves nothing. Anyone could have. Anyone could not, Poirot interrupted gently. One must know exactly what to look for. Only the man who mixes his own polish and powder would recognize it on sight and attempt to remove it. You have just told us that man is you. Corbett gave a short, sharp laugh. Well, there's your ghost, Poirot. Flesh and blood, after all. Julian turned on him. You wanted me guilty from the start. Why? To keep eyes off yourself. Armbury stepped between them. Enough. We'll not have this turned into a brawl. Poirot's gaze was steady. Monsieur Whitcomb, I do not arrest you. Not yet, but you will remain in the Winterbourne until the end of the evening. The trick, you see, is not quite over. There is one more step in performance, and I think you will wish to be present for it." Julian's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Poirot replaced a folded paper in the chair, as though it were an actor waiting for his cue. Then he turned to the group. "We will reconvene here at 9:30. Between now and then, I suggest you enjoy the hospitality of the lounge. But remember," his eyes traveled over each face, resting just a heartbeat longer on Julian's. "The house, like the conscience, has many doors, and some of them close from the outside." As the guests filed out under Arnberry's watchful eye, Poirot lingered with the inspector. "He would have made for the servants' door if you hadn't stopped him," Arnberry murmured. Poirot nodded. "He would have gone not to flee, but to hide or destroy the second half of his apparatus, the part that links the theater in the attic to the murder on the floor below. Now, knowing he cannot reach it, he will either try again or betray its hiding place by watching it too closely. Either way, mon ami, the little gray cells will be ready." Arnberry's mouth curved in a grim smile. "And if he does try again?" Poirot smoothed his mustache. "Then, Inspector, we will be there before him. A conjurer cannot bear to watch another man finish his trick, and tonight I shall finish it for him." They left the ballroom together, the stage set and waiting for its final act, while beyond the doors of Winterbourne's corridors whispered with a small, urgent sounds of guests who knew that before the night was out, some among them would no longer be able to leave. Chapter 14. The Watchers in the Corridors. The lounge at the Winterbourne had never seen such a tense assembly. Guests sat in clusters, their conversation hushed and fragmented, the clink of glasses punctuating the uneasy quiet. A fire burned in the grate, but the warmth did little to reach the cold at the edges of the evening. Outside, the rain had thickened into a fine, persistent drizzle that blurred the street lamps beyond the tall windows. Julian Wickham sat apart, his long legs stretched before him, a glass of brandy in hand. He sipped without tasting, his gaze fixed somewhere past the flames, though his eyes flickered whenever a servant passed too near the door to the service wing. Lady Margaret kept to a corner, speaking in low tones to Mrs. Mather, whose drawn face suggested she was as much spectator as prisoner to the scene. Torrance and Miss Vale sat together at a small table, the former tapping a cigarette against his case with restless energy, the latter watching him as though unsure whether to trust his nerves or fear them. Poirot and Inspector Arnberry, meanwhile, maintained an unassuming watch from the far end of the room. To the casual eye, Poirot might have seemed absorbed in folding and refolding his napkin, but Arnberry knew better. The little Belgian's gaze moved with quiet precision, tracing the movements of each person, noting who shifted uneasily when the clock struck the quarter hour, who glanced toward the hall at the sound of footsteps. It was a waiting game, and Poirot knew the pressure time could do what direct accusation could not: crack the composure of a guilty mind. He had arranged matters so that the service corridor, the one leading up toward the attic stair, remained in the periphery of everyone's view. The mere presence of that door was a silent provocation. 8:30 brought a minor disturbance. One of the junior waiters entered with a tray of fresh coffee and petit fours. The scent of the brew filled the room, but more interesting to Poirot was the way Julian's eyes followed the boy to the sideboard nearest the service door. His fingers tapped twice on the arm of his chair before he rose to pour himself a cup. It was a small movement, but Poirot's mustaches twitched in appreciation. At a subtle nod from Poirot, Arnberry excused himself and strolled toward the hallway beyond the lounge, looping round so that he could keep the service door in sight from the other side. The electrician from earlier had been quietly reassigned as a watchman in the attic itself, instructed to remain perfectly silent and note any disturbance above. For a quarter of an hour, nothing happened. The conversation in the lounge loosened slightly, the guests mistaking the lull for safety. Torrance began recounting a story of a stage performance gone disastrously wrong. Lady Margaret even managed a faint smile. But Poirot's eyes never left Julian. It came suddenly, in the space between a laugh and a sip of coffee. Julian set down his cup, patted his pockets as if searching for a cigarette, and drifted toward the service door. He moved with the casualness of one heading nowhere in particular, but when his hand closed on the brass knob, Poirot was already rising. "Ah, monsieur," Poirot called, his tone light. "Perhaps you would permit me to join you? I am in need of a little promenade to aid the digestion." Julian froze. then turned with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Of course, I was only going to stretch my legs. They stepped into the narrow, dimly lit passage. The noise of the lounge fell away, replaced by the hollow echo of their footsteps on the tile floor. The corridor bent sharply after a few paces, leading toward the back stair that serviced the upper levels, and, eventually, the attic. "I see," Poirot said conversationally, "that you favor the path less taken. It is a quality of some value to an inventor." "No." Julian's jaw tightened. "I'm no inventor. Mais non, and yet one could almost admire the contrivance, the overhead performance, the deception of sound. A pity it was used for so dark a purpose." They reached the foot of the narrow stair. Julian's hand was on the banister when a shape detached itself from the shadows ahead. It was Armberry, his broad frame blocking the way. "Evening," the inspector said, his voice mild but immovable. Julian stepped back. "Am I not allowed to walk in my own hotel?" "Allowed?" Armberry's brows lifted. "Depends on where the walk takes you. This way is closed tonight." Poirot regarded Julian with a faint inclination of the head. "Perhaps, monsieur, you will return with me to the warmth of the lounge. The final act will be ready soon, and I should not like you to miss your cue." For a moment, Julian seemed on the verge of defiance. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned back down the corridor. They re-entered the lounge, Julian's expression cool, Poirot's unreadable. The others glanced up at their return, questions hanging unasked in the air. Poirot resumed his seat, and the clock ticked toward 9, with almost theatrical deliberation. By the time the hour approached, the atmosphere in the lounge had grown taut again. Servants arrived to escort the party back to the ballroom. The parquet gleamed under the relit chandelier. The lone chair still occupied its place on the floor, the folded paper resting in plain view. Poirot took his position near the chair, Armberry a few paces to one side. The rest of the guests formed a loose semicircle. The air smelled faintly of dust and polish, as though the very walls were holding their breath. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, "you have been most patient. Now we shall end the waiting. The question of the footsteps, who made them and why, is about to be answered, and I warn you, the answer will not merely explain, it will condemn." A ripple passed through the group. Julian shifted his weight. Lady Margaret clasped her hands tighter. Somewhere in the far corner, a floorboard gave the faintest creak, and every head turned toward the sound. Poirot's eyes glinted. "Ah, you hear it, yes?" The footsteps once more. The room seemed to contract as silence fell. And then, from directly above, there came a slow, deliberate tread, just as it had on the night of the auction. Only this time, Poirot was smiling. Chapter 15. The final descent of the footsteps. The sound seemed to thicken the air. Those in the ballroom stood rooted, their heads tilted toward the painted ceiling as the heavy, deliberate tread traveled across it. Slow, measured, with each pause long enough to make the silence between steps almost unbearable. Poirot, still at the center of the semicircle, allowed the noise to continue for a full half-dozen paces before raising a hand. "Inspector," he said softly. Armberry vanished through the side door, his boots whispering across the polished floor. Seconds later, a faint disturbance came from the rear stairwell. Quick steps, a muffled exclamation, and then the sound above abruptly ceased. The guests stirred, exchanging nervous glances. Miss Vale clutched her handbag more tightly. Torrance's cigarette trembled slightly between his fingers. Lady Margaret's eyes darted toward the exit, as though some part of her was already rehearsing a retreat. Poirot stepped toward the center chair and picked up the folded sheet of paper lying upon it. His voice carried clearly as he said, "These footsteps, Miss Amos, they are not the work of a phantom. They are, how do you say, a performance, a device." The door to the service corridor opened, and Armberry returned, one hand gripping the arm of the young electrician, who had earlier helped examine the attic beams. The man's face was pale, his cap askew, and in his other hand he still clutched a curious contraption, a length of thin timber with small rubber pads affixed at intervals, connected to a taut wire and pulley assembly. Found him crawling along the crawl space above the attic boards. Armberry said grimly, "This here is what made the sound. Weight it right, and it mimics a footstep exactly. A murmur rose from the assembled guests. The electrician stammered something about being paid to test the acoustics, about not knowing anything of the murder. Poirot inclined his head toward Armbury. We will listen to his story later. For now, he has served his purpose. He has shown us the means. He set the device carefully on the chair and let the silence stretch. The question remains, who engaged this young man, and to what end? Consider Ammius Amos. On the night of the charity auction, while all eyes were turned upward in wonder and unease at these mysterious sounds, a man was killed in his room. The footsteps above served not to frighten, but to distract. Torrance spoke up, his voice tight. You mean the murderer used them to cover their movements? Exactment. While the attention of the guests and of Lady Margaret herself was fixed upon the ceiling, the assassin entered Sir Reginald's room. And note, there was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance of the lock, which means either a duplicate key or the original itself. Poirot's gaze slid meaningfully to the hotel owner. Lady Margaret's lips parted, but before she could speak, Julian shifted forward. This is absurd. You're making this into a parlor trick. That man's death could have been from natural causes. Non, Poirot interrupted gently. The examination by the doctor told us of a constriction to the throat. Quick, silent, deliberate. Murder, monsieur. And the true trick was not the death itself, but making it seem impossible. He paced slowly, his patent leather shoes glinting under the chandelier. The device of the footsteps was set earlier that evening in the attic, by someone who knew the layout of the crawl space. It could be operated from the narrow stair, by pulling the wire. And who would know the quiet routes of this hotel better than a man who grew up within its walls? Julian's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. If you're accusing me, you'd better have more than speculation. Mais oui, Poirot said softly. And I do, for when we examined the dust in the attic, Inspector Armbury noted the prints stopped halfway. At first glance, curious. But then I understood. They stopped where boards had been lifted and replaced so as to conceal the small chamber beneath. And in that chamber we found the very wire you see now, coiled and ready. Upon the timber handle, traces of varnish, identical to that used in the repairs to the West Wing. Repairs supervised, I believe, by you, Monsieur Whitcomb. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Lady Margaret's knuckles whitened upon the back of a chair. Miss Vale's eyes darted to Julian, then back to Poirot. Julian took a step backward. You're twisting coincidences into proof. I had no quarrel with Sir Reginald. On the contrary, Poirot said, his voice still mild. You had every quarrel. He intended to call in the debt your late father owed him, an amount that would have forced the sale of the hotel. Without the Winterbourne, your fortunes vanish. And so, you arranged this elaborate misdirection. You knew the attic's acoustics. You hired this young electrician to operate your device at precise moments, and while the ballroom stared upward, you slipped along the service passage, used a master key you had taken from the office earlier that day, and silenced Sir Reginald forever. Then you returned unseen before the final tread sounded above, sealing the illusion. Julian's breath came more quickly now, though he still forced composure. And where is this supposed master key? Poirot held up the folded sheet of paper. In your haste, you returned the key to the safe before the night was over. But you forgot this, an inventory list you used to determine which keys were kept there. It bears your initials in the margin, written in the same pencil you carry. And one more thing, the wire of your device carries faint smudges of stage makeup, the same shade you used to darken your hairline for your little stretch of the legs earlier tonight, when you hoped to reach the attic once more to remove the evidence. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the faint crackle of the fire in the grate. Julian's gaze flicked once toward the exit, but Armbury shifted slightly, blocking the path. Poirot placed the paper on the chair, his hands clasped before him. It is finished, monsieur. The footsteps on the ceiling will walk no more. They have reached the end of their path, and so have you. Julian straightened, his expression freezing into something unreadable. Well, he said after a pause, it seems your performance was better than mine. Then, without another word, he allowed Armbury to lead him from the room. The guests remained in place for a moment, the weight of revelation pressing down upon them. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Poirot, with a faint sigh, smoothed his mustaches and glanced up at the now silent ceiling. "Ah," he murmured, and once again it is quiet. Chapter 16, The Quiet After the Storm. The echo of Julian Whitcomb's footsteps, now muffled by the corridor's carpet, lingered in the minds of those left behind. It was as though the absence of the accused had drained the ballroom of its remaining warmth, leaving behind an air that was cool and weighty. The chandelier above trembled ever so slightly, its crystals tinkling faintly, a sound that now felt almost too close to the earlier, deceptive tread upon the ceiling. Lady Margaret sank slowly into the nearest chair, her gloved hands lying motionless in her lap. The lines about her mouth had deepened, and though her back was straight, her eyes had the distant sheen of one trying to absorb the enormity of truth she had hoped never to hear. Miss Vale moved toward her as if to speak, but Poirot intercepted the gesture with a gentle lift of his hand. "Let us allow her a moment, mademoiselle," he said quietly. Inspector Armberry returned a minute later, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "He won't be slipping away. We've a constable posted at both exits, and another waiting at the station. He'll be in a cell before the hour's out." He lowered his voice. "Odd business, though. The young electrician swears he didn't know there'd been a killing until the arrest. Claims Julian paid him to enhance the atmosphere for the auction. Says he thought it was some sort of party stunt." Poirot nodded slowly, as though this were no surprise. "Such are the methods of those who weave mischief, mon ami. They allow others to play their part while knowing nothing of the greater crime. It gives them both a shield and a scapegoat." Miss Vale's voice, brittle yet controlled, rose into the hush. "So it was all for money? To keep the hotel?" Poirot regarded her a moment before answering. "Not merely money, mademoiselle. Pride, too. The Winterbourne is not just bricks and rooms to Monsieur Whitcomb. It is a last possession of a family name, a facade behind which he could pretend that time had not stripped him of influence. To lose it would be to admit the truth. And so he arranged a drama in which the rest of you would be players without knowing the script." A small, humorless laugh escaped Torrance. "Well, I suppose the man had style, I'll give him that. Footsteps in the ceiling. Never seen the like." Poirot gave a faint shrug. "Theatrics, yes. But, as with many illusions, it required perfect timing. The sound had to begin just before his approach to the victim's room, so the attention of the ballroom would be fixed upward. The return of the noise after the deed. Ah, that was the masterstroke. It made all believe the walker above had never ceased his phantom pacing. He walked to the side table where a decanter and several cut-glass tumblers stood. Without asking, he poured a modest measure of amber liquid for Lady Margaret and placed it gently before her. She accepted it without a word. Miss Vale tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "But how did you know it was him? Others could have had the key. I myself—" She stopped abruptly, perhaps aware she was treading on ground that might lead to her own questions. "You might have," Poirot said mildly, "and so might several others. But only one among you combined opportunity, knowledge of the building, and a pressing motive. The repairs to the West Wing months ago gave him both the reason to examine every hidden recess of the upper floors and the chance to test their acoustic properties. I also consider the psychology. He was the only one who, after the first sound on the night of the auction, did not crane his neck like the rest. He knew precisely where the sound would come from. There was no need for him to search for it. Inspector Armberry's mouth twitched into a smirk. "I thought I'd noticed something odd about that." Poirot's eyes softened, and he looked again to Lady Margaret. "You have my sympathies, madam. This affair will cause you distress in ways I cannot measure. Yet you will keep the Winterbourne. Monsieur Whitcomb's debts to Sir Reginald are now matters for the estate, and the law will decide the rest." Lady Margaret's lips trembled, but she inclined her head in acknowledgment. One by one, the remaining guests began to stir from their places. Torrance muttered something about fresh air and made for the veranda. Miss Vale slipped quietly toward the door, her heels clicking in a rhythm too brisk to be casual. Poirot remained by the chair with the decanter, watching the dispersal as though the scene were not quite finished. Arnberry stepped up beside him. "You're still thinking something over." "Always, mon ami," Poirot said softly. "For though the main matter is concluded, there are still small threads. A proper case is like a tapestry. You cannot leave the loose ends hanging." He straightened his cuffs and glanced once more toward the high painted ceiling, now still and unremarkable. "There are questions to put to the electrician, and to Miss Vale, and perhaps to Lady Margaret herself. The night is not entirely over." The inspector gave a resigned nod, sensing that Poirot's idea of an ending was never quite as final as others. In the corridor beyond the ballroom, the sound of Arnberry's constables echoed faintly, a reminder that, though the footsteps in the ceiling had stopped, the consequences of those steps were only beginning to descend. Chapter 17. Shadows in the Reading Lounge. The Winterbourne's reading lounge was a quiet pocket of shadow at this hour, lit only by a pair of shaded lamps and the faint red glow of the coal fire. Outside the tall windows, the rain had resumed, drawing soft streaks upon the glass. The hush was a relief after the oppressive murmur of the ballroom. It was here that Poirot had requested Inspector Arnberry to join him, along with Lady Margaret, Miss Vale, and, at Poirot's insistence, the young electrician, now released from immediate custody, but looking distinctly as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Poirot stood near the mantel, his reflection wavering in the dark glass of a framed oil painting above it. He did not speak at once. Instead, he let the silence lengthen, and in it, the faint pop and hiss of the coals seemed unusually loud. When he finally turned, his expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable precision to movement, every gesture deliberate. "Mess Amos," he began softly, "we have before us not a puzzle of great complexity, but one of careful craft. The footsteps, the locked door, the suddenness of Sir Reginald's death, these were the stage settings. But every theater hides, behind its scenery, ropes and pulleys unseen." Miss Vale's eyes flickered to the electrician. "And you were the rope puller, were you?" she asked, her voice low and edged. The young man flushed. "I told the inspector I thought it was a harmless trick. Mr. Wickham hired me to rig a length of hardwood along the attic beams. Weighted at one end. The idea was you drop it just so, and it sounds like steps." "Aye," he faltered under Poirot's gaze. "I didn't know anyone would that it'd be part of—" He trailed off entirely. Poirot inclined his head, almost kindly. "I believe you, mon garçon. Your role was mechanical. But what interests me more is why such a ruse was necessary. Monsieur Wickham could have struck without the noise, but he required distraction, not for the ballroom alone, but for one particular pair of eyes." Arnberry frowned. "And whose eyes were those?" Poirot's gaze shifted very slightly toward Lady Margaret. She stiffened, the pearls at her throat trembling faintly. "Mine," she said, but her tone carried more weariness than surprise. "Just so," Poirot said gently. "For you, madam, would have noticed the approach to Sir Reginald's room. You knew his habits, his hour of retiring, the position of his door. But if your attention was drawn upward, your mind engaged with the absurdity of the sound above, you would miss the shadow passing along the corridor." Lady Margaret gave the smallest of nods. "I did look up. I remember thinking how odd it was. And when I looked back, the corridor was empty." Poirot moved closer to the fire. "This is what we call in the theater. And yet, in creating this illusion, Monsieur Wickham left behind the smallest imperfection, something so trivial that most would not notice it at all. But it is in such trifles that the truth resides." He drew from his pocket a folded handkerchief. Resting on its white surface were two fine brass screws, their threads still clotted with a powdery dust. "These I found in the attic beam above Sir Reginald's room. They once held a small metal bracket. Its counterpart I found upon the floor of the attic, directly over the point where the footsteps ended." The electrician straightened, startled. "That's from the weight rig. Must have come loose when—" "Exactly," Poirot interrupted softly. "It came loose because it was adjusted in haste, perhaps only minutes before it was needed. A man who had rehearsed his crime weeks in advance would have secured it firmly. But here there was urgency, and that inspector tells us something important, that the plan was adapted at the last moment, that Sir Reginald's death while prepared for, was carried out sooner than intended. Arnberry rubbed his jaw. So Wickham was desperate. Desperate indeed, Poirot agreed. Perhaps he learned that very night of some move by Sir Reginald. Perhaps a demand of repayment was to be pressed the next day. Perhaps there was a buyer for the hotel already waiting. Something lit the fuse early. Miss Vale's voice was sharp. You speak as though you were in a room with them. Poirot gave a small, almost apologetic smile. Non, mademoiselle, I only listen to what the evidence tells me. And tonight, it told me that one man climbed to the attic in evening dress, in polished shoes that left dust prints upon the beam. He set his little theater in motion, descended unseen, and made his way to Sir Reginald's room with a key acquired weeks before. The rest, he spread his hands. The rest is what you have all seen. Silence followed, broken only by the steady tick of the mantel clock. Lady Margaret stared into the fire, her face half in shadow. The electrician shifted on his feet, his eyes darting toward the door. Poirot, sensing the moment had reached its natural close, straightened. Inspector, I leave the legal matters to you. My part here is done. But there was something in his voice that suggested otherwise, a faint undercurrent, as though some final thread was still wound about his thoughts. And indeed, when the others began to leave the lounge, Poirot remained by the fire, his gaze fixed not on the flames but on the darkened window. Outside, the rain blurred the lamps into wavering halos. Somewhere beyond them, in the city's unlit streets, the echoes of the night's footsteps seemed to fade into silence. Yet his brow was furrowed, as though he still heard them. Fainter now, but moving still. Chapter 18, The Last Footstep. By the following evening, the Winterbourne Hotel had resumed its outward elegance, though an undercurrent of unease lingered in its corridors. Guests kept their conversations low, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile quiet. The ballroom stood empty now, its chandelier throwing pale light over an unused parquet floor. It was here that Poirot had asked the principal figures to gather. Lady Margaret Wickham, pale but composed, Inspector Arnberry, weary but attentive, Miss Vale, her expression a mixture of defiance and curiosity, and the young electrician who kept near the wall, his hands clasped tightly before him. Poirot stood at the center, his small frame upright, his eyes bright with the contained energy of a man who has reached the final note of a long, precise melody. Mesdames, Messieurs, he began, I promised myself I would not leave this place until I had heard the last of the footsteps. Last night, I believed the case solved. Monsieur Wickham, absent from us, was clearly the architect of Sir Reginald's death. But this morning, as I considered the matter over my tisane, I realized something very important. The footsteps, they were not Wickham's invention at all. A stir passed through the group. Arnberry frowned. But the electrician, he confessed to building the device. Ah, yes, Poirot said, raising a finger. He built it, but not on Wickham's instruction. His gaze turned, unhurriedly, to Lady Margaret. It was you, madam. Her composure cracked. Just for a moment. That is absurd, she murmured. Non, Poirot said gently. You feared your nephew's desperation. You suspected he meant Sir Reginald harm. So you hired the electrician yourself, to create a sound that would distract him, give you a chance to intervene if he tried. You thought, perhaps, the footsteps would frighten him away from his purpose. But you did not realize that your plan would give him the very opportunity he needed. She drew in a breath, her gloved hands tightening in her lap. I only want to protect him. I believe you, Poirot said, and there was no mockery in his tone. But fate, she is a mischievous playwright. The noise you commissioned drew your eyes upward, just as it drew everyone's. In that moment, Wickham passed unseen to Sir Reginald's door. Miss Vale's voice cut in sharply. Then Lady Margaret is as responsible as he is. Poirot turned to her, his eyes steady. No, mademoiselle, there is responsibility of the law, and there is responsibility of the heart. Wickham acted with intent to kill. Lady Margaret acted with intent to save. The law will not confuse the two. Arnberry, who had been silent, gave a slow nod. And Wickham, Poirot sighed. He has left London, but not far. I have already given his likely direction to your men. Inspector, he will be found. There was a long pause. The rain tapped gently at the ballroom windows, as though echoing the faint rhythm of those attic footsteps. Poirot looked upward, his gaze tracing the painted ceiling. "I told you," he said softly, "that I wish to hear the last of the footsteps. But they will not be heard again, because they were never truly footsteps, only an echo of human folly, cleverness misused and fear misplaced. They have walked their last." He adjusted his cuffs, the moment of gravity giving way to the precise elegance of his manner. "And now, MES Amos, I will leave you to your evening, for Hercule Poirot has other engagements, and happily, none involving attics." He crossed the floor toward the door, his polished shoes clicking against the wood. That sound, measured, assured, was the only footstep that lingered as he vanished into the corridor, leaving the Winterbourne quieter than it had been in days. And though the ceiling above remained as it had always been, painted and still, those who had been there swore in later years that they could sometimes hear a faint tread in their memory, one that stopped abruptly, halfway across the room, and never came again.